Among the few things I have learnt in my life, one is this: be selective about the things you get involved in. I'm still some way off from mastering the fine art of being dispassionate, but more and more, when I watch the outrage erupt on social media or the newest scandal on news television, I tell myself not to get involved, not to get all het up about it. My slogan to live by is a simple one: not my circus, not my monkeys. My power to change the world is limited, so why sweat what I cannot control? Now, I would imagine that this is what many economists would think if they were actually asked to become a part of government and help run the economy, especially in India, known for its oppressive state, so resistant to change, and its venal toxic politics. Why get involved? Stay away and pontificate from a mile high view. My guest on the show today is a well known economist who was asked 6 years ago to join our central government as the chief economic advisor. He might well have refused the offer, thinking, not my circus, not my monkeys. But he did not. He joined the circus.
Welcome to The Seen and the Unseen, our weekly podcast on economics, politics, and behavioral science. Please welcome your host, Amit Varma.
Welcome to The Seen and the Unseen. My title for this episode is What a Long Strange Trip It's Been. And I'm actually referring to two trips here. One is that of the Indian economy through 70 years, a complex monster passing through complicated times, starting small and ending troubled. The second journey is that of my guest, Subramanian, who joined Narendra Modi's government in 2014 as Chief Economic Advisor, excited about having the chance to do work that could have an impact on the lives of millions. He held that post for 4 years and continues to speak out today as a public intellectual. I was delighted when he agreed to come on the show to speak about both India's journey in the last 73 years and his own in the 4 years he spent in government. I have been a constant critic of this government's economic policies and did not refrain from asking hard questions. Arvind, showing tremendous grace and patience, gave me forthright answers for more than 3 hours. I'm sure even his former boss Arun Jaitley never grilled him for so long. No, but seriously, this was one of those digressive conversations that I really enjoyed, spending as much time on large meta questions as on policy nitty-gritties. Do note one thing, by the way: due to a technical glitch, there were some minor sound disturbances in the recording, which we have tried to cover up in the edit. I'm sure you'll get lost in the engrossing flow of ideas and not even notice. Before we begin our conversation, though, let's take a quick commercial break. Are you one of those people who not only loves to read but also wants to write better? If so, I have something for you. Since April this year, I've been teaching an online course called The Art of Clear Writing. 4 webinars spread out over 4 Saturdays in which I share whatever I've learned about the craft and practice of writing over 25 years as a professional writer. The course also contains many writing exercises, discussions on email and WhatsApp, and much interactivity. It costs rupees 10,000 or $150. You can check out the details at indiauncut.com/clear writing. This link will be in the show notes. If you want to bridge the gap between the thoughts in your head and the words on the page, then the art of clear writing might be just what you need. September batches begin on Saturday, September 5th, so hurry and register before then. indiauncut.com/clear writing. Arvind, welcome to The Seen and the Unseen.
Thanks, Amit. It's great to be on the show.
Before we start talking about your exciting career, and various aspects of that are so interesting to me, both your time as an economist and your time working as, in the government to actually bring about change. I want to talk a little bit about your sort of personal growth, because I was sort of looking at your CV and I found it very interesting in the sense that I assumed that, you must have taken the typical economist path where you've kind of gone abroad and done a PhD and all of that, but you actually, you did an MBA from IIM Ahmedabad. And what I can see from all your public readings and speeches is that unlike the, most economists have this almost this dry reputation and of not being interested in other things and always, engrossed in numbers. But you actually given a lecture on, what economists can learn from literature. You are the only person I can think of who can quote both Keats and Keynes. So tell me a little bit about your time growing up, your formative influences, and, what your personal journey was like.
Right. It's a bit always a little bit awkward to talk about oneself, of course. But Amit, let me just begin by saying that when I said it's great to be on the podcast, I should have added that it's almost now a mark of you only arrive as a public intellectual in India when you've been on Amit Varma's podcast. I think this is a kind of
That-
certification
That's
of
so
that.
kind of you.
So thanks for having me on the show. Yeah. So in terms of growing up in a very kind of pretty conventional middle upper middle class household. My father was in the government. He was in the audit and account service, and he was a very unusual civil servant. He was posted in the most godforsaken places. Where everyone would try and want to be in Delhi, whatever he would, we spent 5 years in Dandakaranya, in Nagaland, Shillong, Ajmer, Udaipur. So I've, traveled all over with him. And then and of course, he was also a painter and a writer. And so the growing up, the household was full of books and things. And what I remember, of course, is that even when I was growing up, this was what in the 60s. My father used to subscribe to, Time, Newsweek, Life. All these things would physically come to the household. So, just almost by osmosis, not that, I was particularly studious or anything, but just by osmosis, I could pick it up. And I have to say that. So just to give an example of, things that we pick up that we forget that we've picked up unconsciously. So one of my, all-time favorite pieces on foreign aid, which I teach in class, is by this New Yorker writer called Philip Gurevich. He also has a great book on Rwanda, on the Rwanda genocide. And, in the early part of the book, he describes the first foreign aid intervention, which is on one of the early foreign aid interventions, which was, what happened in Nigeria and Biafra. And he has a line describing, the famine that happened. And he describes those, children with, the victims of the famine as stick-limbed, balloon-bellied, ancient-eyed. And, I was just blown by that description. But then I remember that the reason why it evoked so much in me was because I remember these pictures in Life magazine of the Biafra crisis and that picture of the boy or the child actually with the distended belly and so on. So I mean, this is just an aside. Growing up, so then I finished my. At about the age of 13, my elder brother was a voracious reader, but I was not. But at the age of 13 or 14, suddenly I realized that, wow, there's this whole world of books out there which I've not at all explored. So almost as a conscious act of catching up on lost time, I would ask my brother to give me a list of 10, 15 books every time he would come. He was in college and I was still in school, so I started reading quite voraciously then. And then of course finished my schooling from Chennai and went to Delhi to do a undergraduate degree in economics. I think it was fairly unremarkable. I think what was great about that period was we picked up almost everything from our peers. So it was really a great, my love of Hindustani music, a love of sports literature, reading, and all of that was intensified of course, growing up, we always listened to Carnatic music at home, but my love of Hindustani music came in college. Then, of course, at that point, you either go to Delhi school or you go to, do an MBA at that point. Those were the kind of standard options. And I had always wanted to, join, the government. In fact, I think I wanted to join the Foreign Service then, I think. So I did my MBA, and in my second year, I wrote the civil service exam, and I failed. I wasn't high enough to get either the IFS or the IAS. And then, of course, I guess it's a sign of the elite networks that we were part of that I got this scholarship. I'm not sure I deserved it entirely, but I got this scholarship to go to England. So after my MBA, I worked for a brief period, 3 months, with the Tatas. They had this Tata Administrative Service, which was like the private sector equivalent of the IAS, but then they gave me leave actually to go abroad. And I went to Oxford I went to do an MPhil in management studies because that's what I'd done in MBA, but I quickly switched to economics. And I think I had, again, a fairly unremarkable MPhil and PhD. I was still kind of unsure of what I wanted to do, not completely confident that, I had actually acquired. Because you see, an Oxford PhD, unlike an American PhD, it was completely, open-ended. You kind of did what you wanted. And today, for example, I mean, it's a dirty secret. Almost all my academic papers are empirical papers, but I've not done one course in econometrics all my life, even though I'm a PhD in economics. So, you could do that if you went to England in those days. So I felt, and then when I finished my DPhil, I did get an academic job. And the truth is, I felt that mediocrity shows up so clearly in academics, and feeling that I was an imposter and mediocre, I kind of ran away from academics, as it were. And then I went to work for international institutions. And then my first job was in the GATT, actually, at the time that the Uruguay round was being negotiated. I still remember I was at the GATT. I was, a young, very young, lowly officer, and I was assigned to be part of the intellectual property negotiations trips. I don't know how many of you remember, but the Uruguay round, the most contentious issue for India and for many developing countries was patent protection and intellectual property. And at that stage, so while working, I did some, fairly not very sophisticated empirical research showing that this TRIPS agreement would be harmful for countries like India, and I even kind of roughly, crudely quantified that. And I guess my early kind of moment of epiphany then was, this was not even kind of probably wouldn't have even been published in any academic journal, but I do remember when and those negotiations, by the way, were really contentious. I mean, I don't know how many of you recall that it was almost touch and go. India was almost considering not signing on to it because of the intellectual property things, because pharmaceutical prices would go up, access to medicine would come down. So I remember, and I did this work. So I remember my moment of kind of epiphany, but also kind of sense of wonder of what the life of a policy economist could be. I was working there, and one of the Indian officials one day, this was I think 90, maybe 3 or 94, I don't know when it was. He came, and he was a senior civil servant in the Indian government who used to work in the Commerce Ministry. He came and said, "Arvind, I have to tell you, last week or a month ago, Carla Hills, who was the US trade negotiator, very tough lady. She was called Carla Crowbar Hills because she wanted to prize open markets in developing countries." And so what had happened was, when I wrote this, I think Montek was the commerce secretary at that point. So this official had passed it on to Montek, and apparently, and Chidambaram was the commerce minister, and he had passed it on to Chidambaram. So this person came to me and said, Carla Hills came and met Mr. Chidambaram to say that, why are you Indians fussing over this intellectual property negotiations? It's going to be win-win for all of us. It's good for India, etc. And then she said, look, I have a bunch of 10 studies to show that this is the case. And apparently, I don't know, of course, it was later confirmed. Apparently, Mr. Chidambaram, the minister, said, well, Ambassador Hills, I have another study which shows exactly the opposite. And he presented her my paper. And so that was a kind of wow moment for me that, one could do policy research and have it taken seriously by policymakers. So that was a kind of quite a heady moment of, and I was very young then. And then after that, of course, I went to work for the IMF, and, again, fairly unremarkable career. But then, I mean, basically my kind of academic life took off in around 2000, I think. I was for the IMF, IMF, you go around, to all the countries in the world. I was the mission leader to Mauritius. And it's just such an interesting country, for so many reasons: literature, history, the Indian presence there. And when I was in Mauritius, I actually saw a festival that you only see in Chennai, a very unusual festival in Chennai, which is related to the god Kartikeya. I saw that in Mauritius, So it's kind of really just to see how traditions kind of persist, in distant places. So I was working on Mauritius, fascinating country. There's a great Naipaul piece on Mauritius. Of course, Joseph Conrad was in Mauritius. Of course, the Amitav Ghosh trilogy begins in, at least part of it is in Mauritius. So I wrote a paper on Mauritius, basically saying, how can you explain this miracle? And I sent it to, Danny Roderick, who was then a friend and a co-author. And, within kind of an hour of receiving that, he said, Arvind, I want this for my volume. And then, of course, then I became, for about 10 years, I think I was doing hardcore economics research, but never situated in academia. I was always, then at the IMF. So Danny and I did a series of research papers. Then Raghu and I did a series of research papers. Then I did on my own a number of research papers. Then I moved to this think tank in Washington, the Peterson Institute for International Economics and the Center for Global Development, because my academic research is mostly on development and global and the global economic system and almost all of that. So I left the IMF partly also because people think that in government you have to be restrained in your public utterances. That was becoming true of the IMF as well, because actually Raghu and I wrote a series of papers on aid. Then I wrote some pieces on Nigeria, which I think senior management there were having difficulty allowing it to be published. So I left because I wanted to write publicly much more. And then, of course, I wrote a book on China when I was in the Peterson Institute, which about the rise of China and so on. Which was so I got a bit into China as well. And then, of course, this what is probably the most exciting 3 years and 9 months of my life was the being chief economic advisor. It was really a completely transformational experience for me in many, many ways. What you learn about politics, about politicians, about the policy making process, what you learn about oneself, how you build teams. And of course, the other thing is how should one kind of behave as a public intellectual in government? What are the dilemmas that you face? The moral dilemmas and things. So many so many unusual things happened when I was in government, and so many choices had to be made. So and then of course now I finished that and left a year before my second contract was about to end, because I felt that I had personal reasons, but also I felt that my usefulness, effectiveness was kind of reaching their limits. And so I was working at the Kennedy School. I was teaching here. And now, of course, as of July 1, I've joined Ashoka University. And so look forward to, probably the last phase of my career.
That's a fascinating life, which you managed to summarize into so little space. I have a couple of follow-up questions, and for one, I want to go a little bit back because as you were talking about your childhood and growing up and going across India, and I felt a little nostalgic because even though I am like 15 years younger than you, I'm in my mid-40s now. It strikes me that I also did a significant part of my growing up before liberalization. I was also a privileged child. My father was a civil servant, so I would imagine that just thinking of all of the people growing up in similar circumstances, in those times, there's certain kinds of music which you end up listening to, there's certain kind of books which you end up
True.
reading, everything that you kind of mentioned about the magazines, and just sort of thinking about myself, I've often thought that what that upbringing did to me is that I grew into a sort of default view of the world that I had, where you take the necessity of state paternalism for granted, that you have a certain approach to everything, and then later on as you go through the years, the scales fall off your eyes and you see the world differently in subtle ways, and obviously this journey would be different for everybody. Now, it's interesting that at a certain point you've done your MBA, you've completed that, and then you go abroad and you spent most of your career abroad. So my first sort of question is that, were there moments where you felt that you could take a step back, and there were some scales that fell off and you could take a step back, and something which had seemed one way to you seemed different? Like, would you say that there was a process like that, or was there a period of time where you felt that you began to look at the world differently? And if so, what was that change like? Were there thinkers who influenced you, and or books that kind of changed or shaped the way you looked at the world?
Yeah, I don't think it would be accurate to say that there was one, point of one or two epiphanic moments where you say, oh my God, whatever. So it was very much, I think, a gradual process. And as you said, I think this whole, the state is part of your state and, is part of your DNA growing up. I think the first thing, kind of the intellectual change, is you go out and you see, wow, all that the state has done wrong, the liberties it's taken away, the whole license control Raj, and you kind of, we used to take 100 and 200% tariffs as kind of normal, right? And then you go abroad and say, what, 3%, 5% tariffs, and what's going on, kind of thing. And of course then I read the old the wonderful Bhagavati Desai Srinivasan literature. You learn about that. And so I think that process of seeing what we were doing wrong, I think it just hits you gradually over time. But then, of course, I think in some ways, the journey in some ways gets completed, because then you say, well, but yes, markets, yes, freedom, yes, liberalism, but what about all the things that the acts of omission that the state has committed? We know the sins of commission. Then you come back and you say, well, what about the sins of and so I think the last 10-15 years have been, I think, a lot about understanding and reflecting on, state and markets in India, what I call the whole stigmatized capitalism, how that's come about in a way that's detrimental to both capital and states. And so I think that's been kind of the intellectual journey to some extent. And I remember, I think in terms of intellectual influences, I was reading a lot, but in the academic literature, I think that, I would almost say that I learned kind of macroeconomics reading Paul Krugman's writings. Actually, I would actually read almost everything that he wrote early on. He has some, wonderful, and just, I think, just how to write clearly as an economist. I think that's been a big obsession of mine. It's not just, obviously the ideas matter a lot, but actually how do you make it communicable? And then, both for me, Danny Roderick and Paul Krugman were really very influential, both in content. Danny's early writings on political economy were, I think, very, very insightful for me. So also to think about, not just state and markets, but the whole, because remember, when we used to speak about, market failure, but I think, the whole question about what is state failure was a very important issue. And therefore, understanding political economy, what are all the things going on, ideology, interests, institutions, the rich interactions between them. I think that was something that I always read about and followed kind of very, very closely.
And my second question arising from that is that, when I read your work, when I read your writings and your speeches and so on, I sense this deep sense of conviction. Like, you've very often spoken about how during your time as the chief economic advisor, you would wake up every morning excited about the day because, every day was so exciting. And obviously it's exciting because you actually get a chance to sort of make a change in the world. And earlier when you're talking about your sort of career, that you do an MBA, the civil services doesn't happen, so you go to Oxford, and after that you feel academics is not the place for you, and then so on, and your entire career path. And there it seemed like, okay, you're sort of going along a career path, and there's a little bit of serendipity to it. So at what point did you start feeling this sense of conviction about your work, that look, my work can make a difference to the world? Like, was there a time where you looked at something and said, this is a problem, I want to solve this problem, my next study is going to be about this? Was that a mindset that you kind of had from the start, or did it sort of evolve over a period of time?
Yeah, I think that, to be honest, it was never, I think the sequence was always, you find yourself somewhere and then you say, wow, this thing kind of, like when I was in the GATT, I was working on the intellectual property negotiations. And then, I said, oh my God, there's such a big issue involved here that I wanted to work on that. Similarly, when I was in Mauritius, again, I said, wow, what a fascinating development experience this is. And I wanted to write. So it's never been consciously kind of trying to find something so much as, I find myself somewhere, whatever, for all kinds of, historical persistence reasons. And then, you say, so all the aid stuff that we did, because I was working in the IMF, in the research department, and, the debate was going, there was a raging debate between, Bill Easterly, Jeff Sachs, and others. And then, I said, maybe one can contribute here. So it was much more that, not so much consciously seeking as, just finding yourself in places. And of course, I mean, to be honest, the thing is that, my kind of principle guiding my research is that the question has to be, very important in terms of policy. I'm not going to do anything that doesn't have a policy impact, and that it has to, the contribution has to be novel and new. So the combination of important in terms of policy, but if I must have something new to say, otherwise, it's not worth it. Why bother? It's so many. So there is a kind of a shock or a novelty element to the stuff that I do, and part of it, of course, is part of that is also a way of getting people's attention to important policy issues. Because I remember the early patent work that I did, I kind of said, the loss is like $1 billion or whatever. So putting numbers onto policy questions, I think is also something that I really, that kind of, really turns me on and motivates me as well. So the combination of, new, important and new facts to kind of evidence to bring to bear. And the difference, I guess, why I don't, maybe haven't chosen this hardcore academic career is because, I mean, I've been less kind of obsessed with this whole, you must show causation in kind of rigorous ways. I mean, for me, the big facts are as important as anything else that should be done. And I think facts change the world. I mean, I can give you examples of that, not my own research, but lots of other people. It's much more the big facts that I think that have a big impact on the world and policy making, as much as any kind of sophisticated attempt at showing, well, this happened because of this. That's important, but I think its role is.
I'd love a couple of examples of big facts that had that kind of impact.
So I think that, to give you one example, Karthik was on your show a few weeks ago. For me, certainly that the finding that the work on teacher absenteeism in India, I think kind of changed a little bit the way we thought about the education debate in India, that, you focus on, whatever, you need to pour money or you need to do other things. But then suddenly this fact comes and hits you and says, wow, this is like, we've completely forgotten about, teachers not showing up and, what that does. And I think that set in train a whole different way of looking at it. And I think, similarly, I think, the pattern stuff that I spoke about, I think that's, and, for example, if you look around the world, the whole, the work that Piketty and his co-authors have done, kind of documenting, the rise in a particular kind of inequality, top inequality. You may disagree with the policy conclusions that follow, but the fact is the world is a very different place in terms of understanding the world because of knowing those facts about the world. So I think that there are, the other, just to give a personal example, is that, in the economic survey, we did some work on migration based on data that nobody had ever used in India, and data that, we had the privilege of getting access to because I was in government. This was the railway data that we had. And my team and I, we made some use of it. And the numbers that came out, were pretty striking, much bigger than what we had believed migration within India was all about. And of course, we presented it. I think it didn't gain a lot of traction, or people didn't cotton on to that. But when the actual COVID crisis happened, the migrant crisis happened, it kind of showed that work was in some ways, not incorrect in the quantification of the magnitudes and so on. So I think, kind of facts are really, but doing it very carefully, rigorously, but on important issues. And that's what I think is really, for me, is very, very challenging and important. And so, even in government, I think people underestimate, the quality of a simple chart. Because I remember very early on, This was, I joined late 2014, early 2015, and we were having these discussions within government on, what to do, etc. And I think, it's not rocket science. I showed Mr. Arun Jaitley a chart of, real wages declining, rural real wages declining. And I could see that, he really, it made a real impression on him. He took note of it, and of course he acted on it in ways that I'm not sure, even I don't know fully, but he did act on it. And I think that so things like that, I think, are really quite important.
In fact, in one of your interviews, you used the phrase the Dracula effect,
Yeah.
which is, to shine sunlight on something so that it kind of becomes obvious. And I was struck by that. So I want to follow sort of a couple of simultaneous paths during the rest of our conversation. One is that through your readings, through your books, through your writings rather, and through your books, I've gained a lot of insights about India's economy post independence. So I want to sort of discuss that journey, the journey that the Indian economy has made from 47 to here, and sort of where we are today, and obviously zoom in on the years that you were actually in government and all of that. And at the same time, I'm fascinated by your experiences within that beast we call the Indian state, and your efforts to sort of bring about reform within that. And many of my listeners are not sort of trained economists that they'll kind of be familiar with all of this already. And so what I'll say is that, to begin with, can you give me a sense of, go back to the choices that we made post independence and maybe for 2 or 3 decades since, and what was so unique about this experiment? Like, you've spoken about what you called a precocious development model, and the two significant ways in which this was so strikingly different and a unique experiment. So can you elaborate on that a bit?
Yeah. So, maybe I will, jump first forward and then backward in time. And I'll come back to your question. So I guess my first real academic piece on the Indian economy, which was also a kind of, which, as you know, triggered a massive debate in India, which was this paper that Danny and I wrote on, how growth took off in the 1980s, especially in 1979, even though the reforms began only in 1991. So, it provoked a massive discussion because people said, no, see, because there are two camps, right? The camp that says, you get growth through reforms. And then even the fact that actually some people had noted that, India's actually, the growth takeoff happens actually 79, 1980, when, before that we had the Hindu rate of growth. You grow at about 3.5%. And then suddenly from 1979, 80 onwards, we grow at about 6%. And so just highlighting that fact, and then saying we have to try and understand this, that if you accept this, then how did we get this sudden, because the real acceleration is not between the 80s and 90s, because remember the 90s growth is pretty much the same as the 80s growth. So how did that happen? And so that was for me a real eye opener. And that my partial explanation for what happened in the 1980s kind of then allows me to now kind of step back and say, come back to your question, which is that, if you look at the kind of broad development choices that we made, and choices to some extent is within quotes because, some of it is just persistence in history and personality. So, how much active agency there was in these choices. When we use the word choice, we connote agency, which may not, at least historically, may not be completely accurate. But I think there were 2 or 3, I would say, the big development choices that we made, right? One is, from day one, you're a democracy and not. So if you look at, there's a recent paper that I wrote with Rohit Lamba, which kind of brings it out even more clearly. It was first there in the economic survey. If you think about it, if you look at the successful models of economic development, there were the two big models, right? One is Western Europe and the US, which is essentially what happens is that economic development happens over 150, 200 years, and political development happens alongside. So there's slow economic and coterminous, co-evolving, slow political development, and that's happened over 200, 250 years, successful and so on. The other model is the East Asian model, which is, post 19 World War II. you have a sudden burst of economic growth. Just to put some numbers, Western Europe grew at about, let's say, 2.5% per capita over 200 years. East Asia, Japan, the tigers, China, and now Vietnam, they grow rapidly. Korea, of course, they grow rapidly over 50, 60 years and kind of achieve almost the same level of income as the advanced countries. But so there's more rapid economic development, right? But there's a sequencing. Economic development comes first, and then political development follows. So you have these two kind of broad models, and India defies that. India is a model which says from day one you have democracy. So both economic development happens after, or at least the attempt is made to happen after political development. So that kind of and remember again, important historical fact is that it's not that this has not happened at all. There are only 4 or 5 other countries in the world that began democracy and embarked on economic development. But these are very small countries, Costa Rica, Botswana, the Caribbean countries, and so on. So there's no comparable, a large. So this is really striking. So therefore, what does that mean for development? And it's something that I'll come to in just a second. So that was one big choice, democracy first, and then you embark on development. Then, of course, we had the whole commanding heights, etc., etc. But remember that the whole import substitution, protecting domestic industry, etc., that India chose, whatever, we may have done it to a much more serious extent than, say, Latin America did. But I think we should never forget that choice of state-led development was completely consistent with the zeitgeist of the times. Not just at that point we thought the Russian model was doing very well. Remember, I think there's a very famous scene event when Khrushchev goes to the United Nations. He picks up his shoe and bangs it on the podium and says, "We will bury you." And people thought he said, "We're going to devastate a nuclear holocaust of the West." But actually what he meant was, economically we will devastate you. Our model is doing so well that we will show you that this is the right model. So if you look at Russia, if you look at the Great Depression, if you look at many developing countries, and of course the whole rise of the welfare state in Europe as well. So that choice, I think, was not at all unusual. You may say right, wrong, we can come to that later, but it was not unusual. I think what was really distinctive about India is that we combine that with this horrendously complicated system, which Rajaji famously called the license quota permit Raj, which there was the complexity, there was the corruption that happened, which is going to be, which is probably the most devastating legacy of all of that. But what was distinctive about that was, look, and this is something that people don't grasp sufficiently. When you protect, you want to help the domestic entrepreneur, whatever. The Bombay, we remember the Bombay plan, basically self-serving, saying, protect so that, we can do it. So that's understandable. But the whole, especially licensing, it actually taxed domestic producers. So whereas protection gives you, is a favor granted to domestic industry, license is a tax on domestic industry, because you say you can't produce more than so much. Every time you want to do this, you have to come and ask someone. So that tax on domestic production, in a sense. So it was a very unusual model where there was both import substitution, but a tax on basically domestic entrepreneurial activity was taxed in a way that very few countries do. And so that was the second kind of the big distinctive thing. The third, of course, I think big choice was that, and the way I like to put it is to say that, this is the country, it's a premature democracy, democracies redistribute, we know that. There's, on top of that, there's the overlay of this hideous hierarchy that we call caste and so on. So how do you redress historical inequality? I think broadly there would have been 2 ways of doing it. One is the whole opportunity route, you give everyone education, etc. But I call this, we of course did not do that. I think it was our second original sin. But instead, what we did was we went in for these guarantees. So I call this in the opportunity versus guarantee thing. We went in for guarantees, which is the whole what we call reservation and so on. And we can talk about. So these were kind of three big choices that we made. Now, I want to link that. Why did I jump start with 1980, 1990? Is because in some ways, what happened in the 1980s was that that tax that we imposed on domestic industry was when we kind of said, let's relax these taxes. Because remember, we call those pro-business, not pro-competition reforms, because the competition only began in 1990 after the opening up. The 80s reform was very much, helping incumbents, helping domestic business by giving them better access to inputs, technology, all of that. So in some ways, the 80s began to rectify the distinctive tax that we impose. And that's kind of partly our explanation for why kind of. Yeah. So if I wanted to put it provocatively, I would say that the 80s were in fact the first decade that we actually did import substitution because, we continued to protect our domestic industry, but we removed the tax on them. And so that happened. Of course, the rest is history. We had a crisis, etc., etc.
I was sort of struck by these sort of broad strands which are happening through Indian history, and it's not only economic, but obviously the thinking encompasses that. One, as you pointed out, is the whole command and control mindset, which, as you said, was, it was the belief of the time. It was completely the rational way to go. In fact, it would have been going against the grain to not go that way. So that's completely understandable. The second thing that really happens in the political domain, but the thinking carries through, I think, to how you should run the economy, is that we don't build a new state. We take over the existing colonial apparatus, and that is essentially the state. And that, of course, is incredibly oppressive. In the words of Somnath Lahiri, it's like a state designed to be a policeman. And that mindset somehow seems to carry through, where not only do we do the sort of welfareism and the redistribution that is inevitable because we are a democracy, even though we've reached that stage much earlier than other democracies which became wealthy before they began to redistribute. We don't have that option, but that's kind of fine. But not only do we do that, we also constrain private capital and distrust private capital. Like Nehru once said to J.R.D. Tata, "Do not talk to me of profit. It is a dirty word," stop quote. And that mindset seems to kind of carry through. And like you, I'm inclined to excuse, Nehru for some of these errors because they were very much the fashion of the time, like you said, import substitution and whatever. And like you've pointed out that, the industrial policy regulation was a huge issue there. And you've also spoken elsewhere of bank nationalization being one of the original sins. In fact, there's a great quote of yours which I found, would not come from other economists, but from someone who reads a lot of literature, which is where you've pointed out, quote, "Over time, original sins become lasting virtues," stop quote. And that's something I'll come back to, because I think some of the original sins are not these specific policies, but a way of thinking about the world, which, one can argue remains to this current day. And those debates sort of over the 1980s, your 2004 paper with Danny Roderick, the debates with Srinivasan, Panagaria, and so on. It's very fascinating. But what kind of strikes me is that even these sort of reforms, where first you have the pro-business reforms of the 80s and you remove some of these restrictions, and then the limited liberalization of 91, which did not touch factor markets, and so much more could have been done. But despite them being so limited, they had such a massive impact on the people. They caused so much good that one can only fantasize about what the counterfactual could have been.
Yeah, so I think, Amit, just to go back on a couple of points on the historical thing, right? When I try and understand why we did industrial licensing and, that whole apparatus of regulating and taxing domestic industry, and you see, one has to try and understand that. And one of the ways I think one partial explanation is that, to me, that it was kind of like the Gandhian overlay on kind of policy, which is that, remember in those days we had this mortal fear of big, big business, people becoming too big, and therefore, what will happen to our democracy if, if you have these very powerful actors. So in a sense, one of the ways I understand this whole industrial licensing was to say that, we don't want even domestic capital, we don't want them to, that's why we had, MRTP. And, the sticks and carrots given to remaining small and preventing small from becoming big. I think I see that as, the other big idea underlying the early choices. So if you go deeper than just saying why did we tax, domestic capital, I think the deeper thing is that, this kind of thing we had for small, whether it was khadi village industries, reservation for the small scale sector, all these laws applying, coming into play when you be exceeding certain size, and the whole fiscal regulatory apparatus, if you look back, was really about favoring the small and preventing the becoming big. And I would argue that, that aspect actually has come to hurt us quite a lot over time, especially when we look more recently at how we've done on, low skill manufacturing, which, exports of low skill manufacturing, which require really size, and so on. So I think that's one historical fact, I think, which we should keep in mind. The other is this whole premature democracy thing, right? I think that, as you rightly said, that the famous finding is that by definition democracy, if you look at the work of Acemoglu and Robinson, they almost say that democracy in a sense was a pre-commitment to redistribution in a way that just a promise of redistribution could not guarantee. So democracies have to redistribute, and of course, in addition, remember what is distinctive about India is that you not just have the imperative of redistribution on one axis of class, you also have it on obviously caste. We have you have it on the basis of region. That's why we have all these policies which says, regions should be whatever. So when you have this desire to redistribute, or this imperative to redistribute along not just one line but many lines, you're going to have problems. And the premature part comes in is that, your capacity to do that is just completely incommensurate with that. And kind of this speaks to your point about, you inherit a state that's basically a kind of, police state performing all these functions. It neither has the capacity nor remember, here I think we should be harsh on our early things, that after all, the state at that point should have said, we can't do many things, but we should provide, say, health and education to everyone, like what China did. They didn't do that. And of course, you don't have the fiscal capacity either to deliver on redistribution or in kind of raising the resources required to this. So that is why what happens is that redistribution willy-nilly takes the form of messing with the price system. Because prices are if you can't, today we say, redistribute, either you build schools or whatever education, or you have transfers, efficient transfers, whatever, right? But then you had neither. And then so the only way you redistribute is through messing around with the price system and distorting everything, low prices for goods, cheap inputs. And so you just tamper systematically with the price system, and then that's what persists over time. It exacts a huge cost toll in terms of the economy. But again, I think you can be very critical about it, but I think the criticism should be more that conditional or not either being able to or choosing to do other forms of redistribution, then you're willy-nilly left with this. So just to give you a modern day counterpart of this, and this is the GST, and because I was kind of privy to these discussions. So take the GST discussion, for example, right? On what should be the rate structure for the GST. And I think this really typifies the early dilemma in some ways, except that it's 75 years on. So we all know that, one rate is the best system. By definition, it's clean, it's simple, it reduces corruption, it's easy to administer, it's going to improve your tax collection efficiency. And as the IMF shows, I think after 2000, almost, 80% of the countries that adopted the value added tax, which is the GST, went in for one rate. So in India, we have this discussion. As you know, I wrote a report then saying we should have three rates, not one rate. Now, think of it this way, that I would have been completely in favor of one rate, right? But remember, though, if you go for one rate, you will have to have some rates going up, right? The rates for essential goods will have to have one rate by definition. Some will go up, some will come down, but some will go up. And those going up will be affecting those, those are goods generally consumed by poorer people. So what do? If you have instruments to protect, those in some ways, transfers, whatever, then of course you would say, one rate. But if you don't have those, you have a dilemma, right? Can you just say one rate and say, go to hell? I mean, I think the political process will not allow that. What we've done historically, of course, is, for every good we say, oh, this is consumed by this strata, this is consumed by this strata. So you have a multiplicity of rates. Each of them is, trying to meet two objectives, the efficiency objective and the kind of equity objective, but, in all its messy complexity. So what I thought the compromise was that we can't do one because state capacity is limited to do the compensation. Therefore, a compromise would be to have, one rate but applying to all goods at the lower end, a standard rate, and of course one demerit good which applies to all the luxuries and so on. So in some ways, the three rate structure that that I propose, of course, in practice and now it's become a multiple rate structure, and so it's gone back to the side of erring on complexity and actually. So conceptually, therefore, a three rate was kind of a compromise between efficiency and equity because you couldn't ignore equity completely. But historically, what we did was, we would have as many rates as there are categories of people we wanted to satisfy. And so that, in a sense, was the early dilemma that, you didn't have, remember, in 2016, we at least have some mechanisms for redistribution like PDS, Manrega, now more and more cash transfers. But at that stage, we had nothing. So willy-nilly, the price system had to bear the brunt of that. And that's where we are. So in some ways, therefore, again, one has to be careful. It's not that, obviously, maintaining and sustaining a democracy are fantastic achievements. And, what's happening to that now, of course, is not within my range of expertise. But to not realize that created also some serious consequences and adverse consequences and burdens. One could almost call it the democracy tax, as it were, the premature democracy tax, as it were. You could see that happening. And to some extent, I think we're paying the price for that.
While you were speaking, a couple of related questions popped up to mind about sort of that historic period before we come closer to present time. So I wonder what you sort of think about these. One, not always. One, in the last couple of years or more, I've been reading up on it and I've done a bunch of episodes on the history of and politics of that period. It struck me that much as we think of the 50s as a time which were Nehruvian, it strikes me that only Nehru was Nehruvian. And it was kind of serendipitous that he was a man in charge. Now, it certainly seems to me to be this way, at least in the social domain. For example, if you look at all the other tall leaders of the Congress, from Patel to Prasad to Pant to Lal Bahadur Shastri later, and all of those guys were leaders with a tilt towards Hindu nationalism. Like, Pant was CM of UP and Lal Bahadur Shastri was Home Minister when the idol was installed in the Babri Masjid. So there it seems that Nehru was a man who kind of stood alone. But in economics, is it necessarily the case that, had Nehru not been there, for example, I think socially India would have looked very different, but economically, would it have been any different? I mean, one hears of the exceptions like Rajaji and Masani and so on, who were sort of a different bent of mind. But one, do your readings give you a sense that there were different directions that could have happened, and it was this one individual who happened to be there, and, that's just how the luck played out? And the other question, which is related, so I'll ask it at the same time, is that it seems to me that a lot of the economic policy of that period was determined after actual intellectual query, where people were grappling with these questions in good faith. Even if we can look back in hindsight and say this was a bad decision or this was a good decision, they were grappling with it in good faith, and trying to figure it out on the basis of ideas. But what seems to me to have happened towards the end of the 1960s is that, we know that a lot of Indira Gandhi's leftward tilt, the bank nationalizations, FERA, and so on and so forth, a lot of that leftward tilt was because she had to politically position herself as being distinctive from the syndicate who were her rivals in the Congress. And it seems that at that point there are sort of three other imperatives that gradually come into the play and consolidate. One is political imperatives and the incentives that politicians face, either if they are appealing to populism or to short-termism because, hey, everybody's got their eye on the next elections. Second, the natural inertia that sets in into any system, particularly a large bureaucratic system like ours, and not just inertia of action but inertia of thought. And third, the interest groups which then get settled in and entrenched and make it difficult to change anything. So was that perhaps a tragic shift which people don't remark on, that we begin with policies that we can criticize today in hindsight, but that were made in good faith with people like Nehru actually engaging with ideas. But we move to a cynical time where ideas don't really matter and you have these incentives from these three different directions driving policy.
Yeah, really a terrific question. You see, I think that we forget when we look at kind of histories of nations, and that there are these critical junctures in countries' history when, some special things can happen. It could be at the time of independence, it could be a revolution, it could be a crisis. So there is something, I feel, if you look at it historically, something distinctive about certain points in time. And I think, clearly for India, that distinctive period was the post-independence period, partly a result of this. So I think, therefore, kind of two or three things come together, right? One is this moment of, idealism and so on, and that's critical juncture. Second is almost intrinsic to these movements is you are going to have politicians with the temperament of, let's set aside personal things and whatever. Maybe the third aspect, what happened in those early years also, was kind of the dominance of the Congress party. So you don't have, political competition. I'm not saying that's necessarily good, but you did have this kind of, because when Mrs. Gandhi comes into power, it becomes more competitive. And as Atul Kohli and others have shown, that creates the whole dynamic that you mentioned about interests and, you need money and so on. So I think a combination of these three things, the critical moment, the idealism, the quality of leaders, the monopoly of or the political monopoly, which kind of allows you to do certain things that might otherwise not happen. But then that comes to the other point that you raise about, was it all Nehru? I think it's undeniable that, state-led industrialization, the emphasis on technology, the emphasis on higher education, I think that certainly comes from, you read Discovery of India and things, what he wants, the whole rationalism, emphasis on science. Because as you know, I think somewhere in Discovery of India, he says quite prescient, quite accurately that if you look at history, for example, around 1450, Mughal India, Aztec America, Aztec Mexico, the Ottoman Empire were, and of course Ming China were at the top of, development, and that's when the Great Reversal happens, from about 1500, 1600 onwards, and then you have the Great Reversal where hitherto rich countries become poor. And Nehru's point is that even then we were losing this edge in science and technology, which kind of contributed. So he was very much into that, and therefore science. But having said that, he had a really dominant role, I think we forget that, one, agriculture, agricultural income was never allowed to be taxed, not because of Nehru. He would have, I think, happily taxed it. It's because of, Sardar Patel and the whole, agricultural thing. Then you also have, as I just said, the overlay of, remaining small. It's not just a Nehruvian obsession. I think it's also this, broader obsession with remaining small, which is, I think, partly a Gandhi legacy, village and small and so on. And of course, also we forget that, I think Nehru's instincts would have been to push land reform much more. But, land reform never went anywhere because partly it was his own democratic instinct. You don't want to do anything by coercion, but partly there was this broader thing. I think so. Therefore, while his imprint was very strong. He loved these big temples and dams and things. So all of that whole commanding heights, I think, is very much him. But there were lots of other things which perhaps were not due to him. And again, counterfactual history is very difficult, because my sense is that, and I think it's an important point that we forget, that I'm not sure, the whole Rajaji's strand of thinking, whether that was ever dominant enough to have, because at that stage, people were completely unfamiliar with how a market economy in all its kind of full-blown thing functions. So I think it would have been, I think our choices, even looking back, I think our choices would have been, statism or less statism, never, a full-blown kind of market economy. But I think some of the more egregious, industrial licensing, I think, was something that we could have really avoided. And of course, I think, I'm just being, unnecessarily kind of, bold here. But I think had we done the education and health that a state should have done, and not had industrial licensing, for example, and allowed actually domestic entrepreneurship to flourish, maybe trajectory of Indian history would have been different.
On that wistful note, let's take a quick commercial break. On the Seen and the Unseen, I often speak about positive sum games. Well, if you want to be surrounded by beauty and you love fine art, I have a win-win proposition for you. Head on over to IndianColors.com. Indian Colors licenses images of fine art from some of the best contemporary artists in India and adapts them to objects of everyday use like tote bags, pouches, and home decor items. You get to surround yourself with the finest modern Indian art at affordable prices, and artists get royalties for every product you buy. Win-win game. The Indian Colors new range is in and includes elegant yet comfortable dresses for women and casual shirts for men with standout motifs by artists such as Tanmoy Samanta, Manisha Gera Baswari, Shruti Nelson, Pradeep Mishra, and Jaideep Mehrotra. Stay home, but dress smart. And if you're missing your friends in these lockdown days, worry not. You can show them you're thinking of them by buying gifts for them from Indian Colors. Corporate gifting is also available. So head on over to IndianColors.com, that's colors with an OU, and make art a part of your life. And hey, for a 15% discount, use the code UNSEEN. That's right, UNSEEN for 15% off at IndianColors.com. Welcome back to the Seen and the Unseen. I'm chatting with Arvind Subramanian on both the fascinating journey of India as an economy and his own fascinating journey in playing a part in shaping this economy. And we've sort of been stuck in history for the first half of the show. Let's kind of get closer to modern times now, where you've kind of spoken about one of the transitions that India made was in sort of moving from socialism with restricted entry to capitalism without exit. And you've also spoken about the Latinization of the Indian economy. And all this is, of course, happening post-liberalization. And, so tell me a little bit about these currents of change that are happening within the Indian economy, for the 2 decades leading up to 2014 when, you finally arrive in India as a CAA.
So I think that India's growth takes off in the 1980s, and then we have this macroeconomic crisis in 1991. Of course, partly it was because the 80s growth was also fueled by this, fiscal binge that we went on. And of course, the fiscal binge we went on was partly also, for the first time, politics becomes, remember at that stage, the Congress loses monopoly, not just at the center, but also in the states. So politics becomes much more competitive. And therefore, I think we find, fiscal policy becoming much more an instrument of, politics, or a much more intrinsic, part of politics. And we have this binge, we have, imports, going up, the classic running out of foreign exchange. It's what, Krugman and call a first generation crisis, was essentially you have a fixed exchange rate, the government spends too much, you run out of foreign exchange, and lo and behold. And then, of course, we had the real opening of the Indian economy. We moved from the pro-business reforms of the 1980s to the pro-market and the pro-competition reforms in the 1990s. And of course, there are different phases what happens, but essentially when I look back at the Indian economy, and I'm doing some work with the colleague Soumitra Chatterjee on how India's trade is done. But if you look back, I think the 90s and the 2000s, leading up to about 2011, 2012, I think it was just a golden age for the Indian economy. I think that, in broad terms, I'll come to what happened, why it kind of ran out of steam. But I think it was a golden age. We opened up, we reaped a lot of the benefits of opening up, the efficiency and so on. Then, of course, we had this, some would say serendipitous, whatever, this discovery of the service sector, the IT sector. But if you look at the 90s and 2000s, I'm beginning to see how across the board, how well the economy performed. It was not just services, it was not just manufacturing, it was just across the board. So clearly we reaped benefits. And what has struck me recently is that in the boom of the 2000s, every economy in the world boomed, but we did much better even relative to other economies. Even our exports were growing gangbusters in the 2000s. That's something that I've been really surprised by. So we had this incredible, kind of the golden age of, the Indian economy in the 90s and 2000s. Definitely, some of it, of course, as we said earlier, is also catch up. You do a little bit of reform. You're so far away from the frontier. Our per capita GDP, let's say 1980, was like probably 3-4% of US per capita GDP. So, there is a logic which says if you're very far behind, you will have some advantage of cheaper labor, so you can grow much more rapidly. And so we reaped, so a combination of, the advantage of backwardness, as it were. We were very poor. Then we did these reforms and, some basic, ability in the economy, some, skilled labor, a modicum of state capacity, whatever, allowed us to do gangbusters. And then, of course, the global financial crisis happens. The world economy collapses. And really, my reading is that we never really recovered from that era. So that, in a sense, was what happened. We never really recovered from that. And of course, this is where I think a new kind of problem arises. And the other problem that you spoke, let me speak about both of these, is that, remember, we never believed in markets. We never believed in capitalism, right? I mean, that was always, and in a sense, the license quota Raj kind of, in some extent, intensified that. You could, in fact, some people call it the era of crony socialism, not just crony capitalism, but crony socialism. Some truth to that. I mean, we forget today how even some of the early entrepreneurs, really became big by manipulating the minutiae of the excise and tariff code. It's incredible, right? So it was always, stigmatized capitalism, we forget. Then, of course, we had this brief period where we says, wow, we've now got at least a modicum of capitalism, which is not based on proximity to the state or favors from the state. And that was the rise of the services. That whole period of the services boom, it was not just services, but saying, wow, India can do a form of capitalism that is, based on good governance, corporate governance, based on not getting favors from government, and and can be internationally competitive. So this is kind of the brief window when we said, oh my God, Indian capitalism is here. And then of course what happens is that we have all these scandals of the 2000s. So the way I phrase that period, what Rajaji called the license quota permit Raj, I call that period the rents Raj, because, and just to be a little bit cute about this, I said you have ethereal rents, terrestrial rents, and subterranean rents, which is, spectrum, land, coal, so the rents Raj. And then, of course, the rents Raj is absolutely devastating because, you say you're back to this old kind of, stigmatized sort of a crony socialism, capitalism, where really we're not really gone past that, really messy relationship between the state and capital. And of course, as a result, both come out with their legitimacy completely undermined. And so therefore, we're back in a sense, post those scandals, in terms of political economy, we're back to a situation where, neither the state nor the thing has legitimacy. So what do you do about it? So coming now to the period that, I was in government, so 2013, 14 onwards, I mean, I do think that a lot of the choices looking back. Oh, sorry. The other thing I forgot to mention in that era of thing was the whole. We had the infrastructure boom, but it also was financed by the public sector with all the telephone banking and all that. So that was part of the rents raj that happened. So fast forward to 14, 15, so on. I think a lot of the choices then were taking place against the background of this stigmatized capitalism. So that constrains a kind of lot of your choices going forward. So, and of course, and this is where then you come to this capitalism without exit problem, and the two are related. And I'll explain that. You had a question, so let me explain that.
Yeah, I just wanted to sort of sum up my understanding of this period and ask you if, it broadly sounds okay to you, and also end with a question. And one is that it seems to me that what happened in 91 was obviously that it was serendipitous. It was a crisis. We had no choice. And, I've had Ajay Shah on the show before, and he's spoken about how there, that intellectual infrastructure of reforms was actually happening from the 80s. You had would-be reformers all there thinking along those lines. And there was some back end there. It wasn't just serendipitous. But what it seems to me that happened was that, look, a crisis forced us into this bunch of changes, but then we got complacent very fast. We took the we took the growth for granted. We took the progress for granted. But the mindset remained the same. The state apparatus remained the same, where the Indian state remained one which doesn't do, like it should do a few things well, instead of which it does a lot of things badly. And that kind of broadly continued. So no mindset change, and we take the growth for granted and don't learn the big lessons that we should learn from it about unleashing private entrepreneurship and so on. And then there's this excellent book by Pooja Mehra, I wonder what you think about it, called The Lost Decade, where she recounts the events after 2008 and what happened in UPA 2, where basically because of the terrorists attacks in Bombay, Chidambaram is shifted to the Home Ministry, and so Sonia Gandhi wants Pranab Mukherjee in the Finance Ministry, as he's installed there and he remains there for a long period. And his mindset is the 70s sort of socialist mindset of the Indira Gandhi era, and it is pretty disastrous because that is when you're having the phone alone scandals, you're having the retrospective taxation, and it's as if the mindset has just done a complete reverse and we start going downhill. And Pooja's narrative, of course, has him being booted upstairs to the presidency, but there's not enough time for Chidambaram back in the finance ministry to make much of a difference. And she describes that a period of the, when the Modi government comes into power, the first few months as being pretty hopeful. You have the bankruptcy code, you have a lot of good people in good positions like yourself and, like Mr. Panagari at Niti Aayog and whatever. So there is some hope that reform will happen. But then there are those jibes of Soot Boot Ki Sarkar, and then there are, state elections being lost. And, like you also mentioned, the Soot Boot Ki Sarkar jibe in a sense speaks directly to the fear of stigmatized capitalism. And what has happened in all this time is that people in India, sadly, still confuse pro-markets and pro-business, and they still, mistake capitalism for cronyism. Whether you call it crony socialism or crony capitalism doesn't really matter, but it's cronyism. It's not free markets. And all of this leads to the political imperative changing and not enough reform happening there. And we'll, of course, get to the sort of the specific economic policies of the Modi government after this. But, is this a summary that you broadly sort of agree with? And if so, or if not, were you sort of, how cognizant were you of this entire changing picture and the politics of the situation when you joined?
Yeah, firstly, just going back to the point that you made about the 1990 reform, I think that there is no doubt that it was, of course, part the crisis, but there's no doubt that there was something else going on, and I would put that something else partly as, of course, all these would-be reformers exposed to ideas outside coming in and having more influence. But I also think that, if you look back, after all, it's not that, just again, intellectual history, that in the 70s and 80s, after all, people said, look at the East Asian tigers, they're doing well, about you guys. I think that the reaction, the pushback always was, but we're India, we're big, whatever. But I think a critical element of the change also was the rise of China. I think that here was a country that, embraced reforms, foreign direct investment, etc. I mean, we'll come to the other part of the Chinese stories, which we haven't internalized, which is the early health and education thing that we'll talk about. But certainly when China in the 80s started booming and embracing things, I think that took the final leg out of the pushback that, oh no, this is not for us, we are whatever. So absolutely right. I think there was intellectual thing building up, but also shaped by experiences around the world, and a critical one being the rise of China. See, now coming back to what you said about Pooja Mehra's excellent book, and how you read what happened. Look, I don't think we have to be a little bit careful here. I don't think anyone believes today that we should go back to 60s, 70s style statism, and I think there has been a decisive shift. I think there's no. I don't think there's any. It's more, I think, that once we've transitioned from the state as owner to the state as regulator, and the state potentially as provider of other public goods, I think that's where I think now the locus of action has shifted to that. I think the problem is that all these discussions have really been, messed up by that experience of the 2000s and all that happened that you described, and you described that, in Pooja Mehra's book as well. And look, I think the closer we are to history, the more we try and put it down to individuals and so on, in a way that I think it's something that we need to guard against. I think it's true that in the 50s we were talking about the 50s. We talk about not just Nehru but all the things. So there's a natural. The closer you are, the more you try and look at it in terms of individuals, and he went here and he went there and all that. I'm not saying is not true. It's just that I think that we don't have the kind of distance to step back and say, are there kind of deeper things going wrong? And in my view, that it's not that I think we said let's go back to statism. No, I think we've decisively the sense that I think that we should be more open is there. So if you look at some of the early actions in the Modi government, so opening up to FDI, for example, was thing, and there's the whole exit problem that we realized that remember that. You see, I think this is where I think we need to be a little bit careful about history also, is that the exit problem was first signaled in a sense by Ashish Gupta and the House of Debt reports. We were seeing that was happening, right? And of course, essentially everyone played this extend and pretend strategy because exit is very difficult in India, and that's why I think capitalism without exit is a serious problem. Now, let's kind of delve in. So in the early period, there was definitely a sense of optimism. And let me say one thing that's a little bit, I think it kind of speaks to this, reduced legitimacy of the state and markets, right? So if you were to ask me, just, as an outsider, as someone who, thinks a little bit about these things, to say, so, okay, how do you reverse this? Because stigmatized capitalism is not going to go away, whatever, right? It has to be done consistently over time. And the only way you kind of reverse that is the state acquiring legitimacy, right, in one sense, and state saying we will be distant from capital. Now, in some ways, you could interpret the early actions of the Modi government as going exactly in that direction. Remember the complaints that happened from business that, nobody sees us, et cetera, et cetera. That was, I think, one way of signaling that, we were going to, put our distance with crony capital. I mean, people would say it wasn't uniform and so on. But anyway, but at least the overt signal was, we are going to be distant. And then on the other side, and this is where I think this, in my view, was one of the major, partial achievements of the government, which I think needs to think, is that, and this is what I think is the distinctive brand of the new welfareism of the Prime Minister. Now, remember, The old welfareism is, you have to, give these, all it would handouts, I mean, I'm just caricaturing here, handouts, PDS, Manrega, whatever, you do the handouts. But the Modi brand of the new welfareism was, as I called it in my book, the public provision of essential private goods and services, right? It's not handouts, so that's distinctive. It's not health and education, so it's not providing public goods. And I'll explain for reasons why I think that was the case. But it's the public provision of private goods, essential goods, power, toilets, bank accounts, and then more recently water, and there are a couple of others. So essentially, the logic is, if you step back, is that the state regains legitimacy by delivering these things effectively. So you regain the trust to be able to do the other things. And I'm going to give you an example of that. And use it, by leveraging the new technology. And that's where this whole JAM thing came in, Jan Dhan Aadhaar Mobile, which, the phrase that, we coined in the economic survey early on. So in some sense, the combination of, look, early on, so to put some kind of method on that initial period, there's a Sudbut Sarkar overhang, right? So we cannot do, remember, this is, people forget, the first opportunity to reform happened on coal when the Supreme Court said, you can, remember that in I think August of 2014, before I joined government, the early opportunity to reform coal was there. The Supreme Court came down in favor, but I think the government chose not to. So that was a Sudbut Sarkar because, you don't want to be a thing. But we distance ourselves from capital and we embark on this to regain the legitimacy of the state. And that's the new welfareism, the public provision of private goods and services. Then we come to the capitalism without exit. So here's a problem, very evident, becoming bigger and bigger. And in 2014, 2015, many of us pointed this out. And, of course, the wanted to do the bad bank, the early attempt to grapple with this exit problem. Now, the problem, stigmatized capitalism and capitalism without exit come together because in order to exit, right, you have to do haircuts, you have to, do these things. And Sudput ki Sarkar means that no public official, no thing is going to be, in the business of doing this haircuts because, immediately the allegation of crony capitalism would be alleged. And so instead of a quick, expedited, executive-led process, and this is what I wrote in my piece yesterday on Mr. Jaitley as well. Therefore, it was really a pass the buck strategy to a judicial process. Luckily, the IBC had been passed and, they said, let's pass the buck to the judicial process. And that's where I think the whole Sudbut Sarkar once again came in the way of, those decisions of, we could have done it quicker, faster, but it would have required some political courage. But then we opted for this judicial process. And, we know what's happened on this judicial process. It's once again run up against all these things. But the point is that I think over the course of the government of this tenure, at least the hope and the expectation was that accumulate enough legitimacy by doing these other things, which are good in themselves. I mean, after all, provision of toilets, nobody talked about toilets, toilets, whatever is really the way to, you gain the legitimacy that gives you the political space to do the other things. So my own reading is that, the corporate tax cut, for example, is an example of, because discussions of this happened early on, and there was no way the corporate tax cut would have happened early on because Sudbut Sarkar, you come in and you do the corporate tax cut. This is just, UPA 2, but in a more legitimate way. But then, again, of course, there was, challenging times, near crisis, corporate taxes were done. But I do think that at that stage, the kind of confidence and courage to do something that was explicitly pro-capital came also because of having some accumulated some goodwill, some legitimacy, and so on. So I think that's how I understand the process, by the way. And of course, also the early hope that, the government attracted a lot of FDI, the GST happened, the IBC happened, this whole, the new welfareism. So in some ways, there was a almost you could, post facto intellectualize this and say, look, there was a kind of coherent thing, but then of course, things have turned out the way they have for various reasons.
Yeah, no, that's extremely insightful, and I have a couple of follow-up questions on that before we, dive into your tenure as a CEA. One question that sort of strikes me, and this is also, one of the chapter titles in your excellent book of Counsel, where you write about the relationship of the state to the individual. And I want to we sort of discuss this particular point not with reference to your own role within the government or within this government at all, but just at a realm of ideas, where it strikes me that when you speak about the relationship between the state and the individual sort of shifting, it seems to be shifting in a sense of better directed paternalism, that okay, we'll do provision of these private goods, we'll use jam, which is Jandan accounts and Aadhaar and mobile, and we'll do all of this much more efficiently, and therefore we'll build legitimacy. And I kind of get that, but the mindset is still a paternalistic one. It's saying we'll be paternalistic in a more efficient way. And what the directional shift which I crave to see, and I don't know how much of that we've seen perhaps since the Vajpayee government, is a shift towards empowering people to help themselves. I mean, markets are a mechanism through which society solves its own problems. That's how I've always seen them. And yet, we've gamed the ease of doing business ratings a little bit, but it hasn't really improved. I have so many friends who run factories and who run businesses, and of course this is anecdotal from my experience, but many of them are viscerally devastated, and not now because of COVID or whatever, but over the last few years. So that's kind of one question where I have a little skepticism, that if I want the relationship between the state and the individual defined, I would like it defined in terms of empowering individuals more to help themselves, which is what markets do, rather than more directed paternalism. And my other question, also the thought that kind of struck me, is something that you articulated while you were talking about it, when you spoke about the post facto nature of giving a direction to all of this, where what you were speaking about, that okay, the state needs to improve its legitimacy, we can't do XYZ like corporate tax cuts because of stigmatized capitalism. How do we improve legitimacy? Let's provide private services better, and all of that sounds very logical. But looking from the outside in, if one looks at our politics, the leaders in charge don't seem the kind of people who would think it through in this kind of manner. Rather, you've had sort of a haphazard, ad hoc mix of policies going in different directions and catering to different incentives, most of them political. And also the fact of the matter is that, and we'll discuss work that you did as CEA, and I loved your economic surveys, by the way, and how closely you worked with Mr. Jaitley. But it seems that a lot, there were key decisions like demonetization in which even Mr. Jaitley wasn't, too instrumental or couldn't do much about it. So I'm just wondering that how much of this is sort of looking back and rationalizing the things that happened, or at the time, is this something that people actually thought, that you had cabinet meetings where you discussed that, okay, we need to first increase our legitimacy as a state, so let's do XYZ, and later we'll do future reforms? Was there thinking like that? And if there was, why did that then get derailed?
Very, very probing and good questions. Let's come back to first, the whole mindset issue, the state and the individual, right? See, I think in a country like India, given this whole legacy where it's all state, and the process is one of kind of the Leviathan being slowly taken off the back. And this is where I think the failure of the state to equip every Indian with the basic human capital to kind of then it's a completely unlevel playing field, unless so in some ways, if you haven't done that basic, which is what, by the way, China did that very early on, the Chinese Communist Party did that early on, and So in that sense, that original sin having been committed, I think all these notions that the individual should be left to the market, etc., they become less, I think, meaningful, or at least the discussion of that has to be qualified by the fact that you haven't provided health and education. I mean, I'm doing some research with Devesh Kapoor on this. I mean, if you look at stunting and heights and everything in India, you think that or if you look at the ASA results on learning outcomes and so on. So if those two key ingredients are so badly underprovided and also so asymmetrically provided between the vast mass and things, then the whole capitalism as an equal opportunity space where people thrive, I think that discussion just becomes much more difficult. So
Can I butt in here? I hear this observation often from people who support statism, which I know you're not doing, but I hear this argument often, and I feel that it's a little bit self-serving. For example, in education, you don't allow private enterprise, you don't allow for-profit education, so therefore, we remain underserved and undereducated, and then you say that, listen, they are not getting educated, the state has to do it, and therefore, you sort of justify the role of the state by saying that it isn't going to happen otherwise, but you're not allowing it to happen otherwise. And this seems to me to be an unfortunate situation that can then, just continue in this vicious circle.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point about how much the I don't know this sector well enough. You had people who know much more on this. I do, but I think all I think is important to note is whether it's an act of omission or commission, and you're saying it's also a sin of commission, not just a sin of omission. I think the fact is that once you have individuals who are not equipped to take advantage of opportunities, it's that's what. The second thing I think is that the state as regulator, because remember, we can't have no one thinks that a market economy, almost everything should be done by the private sector, obviously, but certain basic things like health, maybe health education along with this, but also some amount of reasonable regulation has to be there, right? But I think so the failure in the last few years has also been that in the last decade or so is that the state as a regulator, I think, has become a very problematic thing. Both the undercapacity, the lack of thing, and of course the capture on the other side from the usual thing. So I think you have both sets of problems, and therefore so on the one hand you say yes, we believe in markets with things, but the essential wherewithal 90% doesn't have the wherewithal. And then post facto, it's kind of, you can't have a marketplace where, firms can pollute, firms can be corrupt, firms can do. So I think in some ways we're kind of stuck, right? Neither at the ex ante stage nor the ex post stage. You have that thing. And then we say, whatever. So it really is, and I say, I think there are just so many things that the state just should not be doing. I mean, state in telecom, as a provider. I mean, state should not be a provider for almost, everything except a few core things, right? But the state needs. So ex ante, ex post, you have such a weak state. And then you have a kind of over-obtrusive state on all this, just this, starting a business. I completely agree with you. I don't know whether you saw that, I saw this on Twitter, how many approvals you still need to start, a small business. So it's like a triple whammy, you don't have the wherewithal, the post facto regulations thing, and you have this thing. And so it's a very fair question as to, why on all of these we haven't changed. By the way, on the regulatory side, there was a period, in the early 2000s where I feel there was some hope that we could get, very effective regulation. I think the early try, for example, was actually doing quite well. And somehow there too, the whole regulatory state has become less. I mean, I think even the RBI, for example, you've had so many, it's a wonderful and highly respected, deservedly respected institution, but all these things that have happened, partly it's because I think partly kind of Urjit Patel's point, partly it's because of public ownership, because there the regulator has less say, but partly it's also because in the areas where the regulator has freedom, we've not been able to, to have a series of scandals like this in a financial system. Is part overbearing state, but part also kind of weak regulation. So I think that when we think about, therefore, and that is why now coming to the last point on the state and the individual, and we can talk about that in terms of the ideas that we were associated with when I was in government. I do think, therefore, that a UBI, a universal, something like a universal basic income, it's kind of says, look, that minimum wherewithal for you to survive, not fall into poverty, not be subject to the vicissitudes of health and education shocks, etc. We provide you that wherewithal, and that allows then the kind of the agenda that you have for the state to kind of get away from the over obtrusiveness. I think that's why ideas like UBI for me resonate a lot, because they're very valuable in themselves in terms of this whole what we want social protection to be. And that's why I remember the UBI is something that both the right and the left like for very different reasons. But it also allows you to kind of not burden the price system, the efficiency cost that the price system has to bear for providing redistribution. That's where ideas like that matter. Now we'll come to your questions about, post facto rationalization versus, in real time, do you actually have discussions like this that say, look, we've had stigmatized capitalism, look, something that came up in your discussion with Pratap as well. I think for me, one of the fascinating, things about being in government is just, getting a glimpse into, personalities and how, personalities really and their, deeper psychology, can be so important in driving these things. Nobody ever studies it. Nobody is going to, write about it because there's so many kind of, but I think it's undeniable. But I think on this thing about the fact that the provision can reclaim legitimacy, I think was actually, I have no evidence, whatever, but just observing, I think one could, even in real time, get a sense of that, even in real time. So I wouldn't say it's all post facto rationalization. I think we have to, some stage credit leaders with, at least some leaders with a sense of, being driven by, obviously they're driven by all the, sordid things that politics is all about. But also I think there are, deeper things that drive. And I think this trying to overcome stigmatized capitalism, recognizing that what does one need to offset. I think I could get a sense of that, at least in the early years that I was there.
Before we get to the sort of your personal experience as a CA, which, I have a lot of questions on that, and I find that sort of that whole experience you must have had very fascinating. But before that, another sort of question in the realm of ideas, because you mentioned the UBI, and I was going to kind of come to that later, which is that, and I also simultaneously want to bring up the GST in this context, which is that there are often ideas which seem to us from a purely conceptual point of view that, oh, these are, so brilliant, this is why they'll make such a great difference, this is why they make sense and all of that. Like GST, for example, I was so excited the first time I heard about a GST coming up. And like you said, people's views of the GST might be colored because of what happened during demonetization, and we'll come back to that as well. But, I'd done an episode of The Seen and the Unseen with the journalist Devanshu Datta, where he pointed out, and this was before the GST was passed, and he pointed out quite presciently all the things that could go wrong with the GST. And as it turns out, I think they did go wrong. Like when I think of the GST, I think of something now, and this is in hindsight and obviously post facto, that it's something that is a phenomenal idea. It's a necessary idea. You want to reduce the friction of so many taxes and you want something much more simplified. But at the same time, it was perhaps foreseeable and even foreseen by others what problems would come. Many of these were unavoidable. They were part of the political economy, like the multiple rates and the exemptions and the different interest groups fighting all the way, and the discretion to the lowest level tax officer, which, frankly, I am at sort of that end of the economy where so many of my friends are at the receiving end of what I can only describe as tax terrorism. And, one of my friends actually is a manufacturer, runs a couple of small factories, and he keeps telling me that, dude, GST was far worse for us than demonetization was. So I asked him to send me some pointers of what went wrong with it, and I'll quickly read through them. He talks about how compliance was much more expensive and tedious, and they now have to have additional full-time employees, a consultant to make sure they're not in violation. The confusion of the initial months costs them actual real money in lost transfers from the old system. The rules and the guidelines keep changing. There is confusion. Is KitKat a biscuit or a chocolate? And more tellingly, that a number of small vendors that he used to work with simply shut down because they were not able to survive in the new regime. That was sort of the transaction cost of shifting from one regime to another, and the cash locked up in the system has made doing business more expensive. And even for me, I have to file my GST every month, and a fair amount of time goes to it. Now, I'm not asking you to address any of these specifically. My larger point here is that in their excellent book, In Service of the Republic, Vijay Kelkar and Ajay Shah made the point that given Indian state capacity, we should have presumptive laissez-faire, which is a separate point. But the larger sense there is that whatever policies that we think about, we should think about in the context of what they call how much state capacity is there. But what I would think of as not just state capacity, because there might be state capacity to implement a lot of this, but also what is the structure of the state. Like when I look at the structure of the state with regard to taxation, it seems to me that it is by and large predatory and parasitic, that where, tax terrorism is a very real term. So the larger question, I'm sorry if I've rambled a bit, but and the reason I thought of this in the context of UBI is that when you think about policies, and even, by the way, people who worked on the IBC, the bankruptcy court, tell me that it is stuck in various places because state capacity hasn't kept up with it, though obviously overall it's a net benefit that we have that reform in place and we have that on the books. So now, my question is that when we sort of implement policies, is one of the things that we should take into account not only sort of how it is intended to work, but how, given what our state is actually like and our structures are actually like, how it will actually work. So to me, it seems that, for example, this is where a lot of GST went wrong and did damage. And one could argue that, okay, in the long run, it'll work out fine, but it did a lot of short-term damage. And similarly with UBI, I could say that, the UBI, with the way you write about it and present it, and others do as well, it obviously, it makes fiscal sense in all your projections where you talk about, okay, we'll cut all these subsidies and we'll cut all these hazard things and all of that. But in the real-time political economy, which is dominated by so many different kinds of interests and political compulsions, many of those are not going to go. And this will eventually, the UBI will also eventually become, if it comes into being, a sort of very perverted populist handout which really helps nobody and has all kinds of perverse, unseen consequences. So is this something that sort of plays a large part in how the policy making mechanism flows, that you're actually considering sort of all of these things?
See, again, very, very important kind of conceptual things that we should think about. But let me just say, just to make it come alive, talk about it in the context of both GST and UBI, right? I think in the case of the GST, look, on this, I would rephrase the Kelkar Shah thing in a little bit more. I think they're absolutely right. I would rephrase this as, in the case of tax, for example, simple tax policy is 70% of tax administration. I mean, if you have simple policy, administration becomes, so the complexity just makes everything worse. So in that sense, I think that there is no question that we kind of definitely have gone excessively in the direction of complexity. But just to be fair to this whole process, and let me just take you back to, I think the feeling at that, so remember, I wanted 3, no more, that was the maximum. I still think we should have attempted that. But I think that the way it went part of the justification was, look, it's less complex than the previous regime. And so that was part of the, so, under, you had like 15 excise duties. Now we only have 7. 7 is, so in a sense, it was, the standards kept changing. Instead of the standard being, look, going forward, what is the best way to maximize the system? This path dependence came in. Now, and this is where I certainly do think that this was something that could have been avoided. The path dependence comes in because, one, you say, look, there are so many excises and VATs. When I change, there should be no increase in the incidence at all. If that's the way, your politics is going to, the policy making process is going to run, then you're going to get into complexity. And I think it was that. So I do agree. I think that the conviction that simplicity is the way forward in itself, and also because it helps, vastly helps administration. I think that conviction, could have been much greater. And I think that has come in the way of that. And so I think, I don't know the income tax system well enough, but remember what you said about tax terrorism. Here's the tragedy, right? The tragedy is, I'm sure what you're saying is right, and I've heard the word tax terrorism, and even the most ardent supporters of the government also think that there's thing. But if you look at actually the tax intake, our tax to GDP ratios, it's not, sterling by any means. So in a sense, we kind of get the worst of all possible worlds. We get the administrative thing, which really chills entrepreneurial activity and whatever, and we don't get the fiscal benefits as well. So the notion that actually simple design and simple administration can help both, is something that I think is a kind of indictment of our system, for not just now, but for many, many. This is a kind of a historical thing. But on the GST, let me say that, again, there was always going to be a short-term cost. Nobody was under any illusion that that was not to be the case. So the question really was, was there adequate preparation to minimize that cost? And I think that's really because remember, after the GST was implemented, steps were taken to minimize the compliance burdens. But I think certainly much more could have been done on that. So I think that was one. And then, of course, GST came on top of demonetization. So, some of the, so that constituency got a double whammy, right? The demonetization and the GST. And therefore, I don't know how much to separate out what is the pure GST impact and what was that. Now, but there are two design features conceptually, I think that so I think on the simplicity, I think we just kind of could have done better, no question about it. And I think there are no real excuses for that. I think we should have and could have done better. And also on the minimizing the tax, we could have done better. For me, the really difficult issues were, looking back or looking forward, we said, look, one market, one India. And I think, again, I don't have enough evidence, but there's at least some good evidence saying that, at the border, the waiting times, etc., have come down considerably. So the virtues of having one market in India, those were huge. And I don't think, looking back, I don't think we should, ignore those things. So I think those benefits were huge. We could have reaped more. And that was what we really wanted, right? In a sense, we wanted India to be one market. It's like, internal liberalization, and the benefits would be huge. The price of that, of course, remember and ex ante, it's not post facto. The price of that was, one, this whole compensation that we say that regardless, we will pay the states as a way of getting political buy-in for this. And the second related point was that we knew that, so the compensation was a short-term thing, right? You want to get political buy-in, but we knew that this one market would come at the cost of loss of fiscal sovereignty for the states, right? And what the COVID crisis has shown is that, states have lost a lot of fiscal sovereignty, and their tax handles, as it were, are now much less than they used to be. And the way we kind of justified or thought about this ex ante is that you do the compensation, you'll have the trust, and yes, there'll be loss of sovereignty, but the underlying system would be buoyant enough that you wouldn't feel that much. It's not that you won't ever feel it, but that trade-off, I think, has started looking a little bit more tricky now. But partly it's kind of endogenous to the way it's been implemented. My own view, as I said in the piece yesterday, is that had we preserved the trust between the center and the states, I think some of these things would have been less of it. So it was ex ante a calculation where we had a certain vision of politics and how federal politics, center state politics to play out, which post facto has turned out to be a little bit different from what we anticipated. In fact, I have a paragraph in my book on the GST where I say that my kind of nightmare scenario for the GST is that, for whatever reason, trust breaks down, and then individual states say, look, we disagree with the center and we're just going to go back and do our own thing, at which point the GST would be just dead. And therefore, I think, the practice of politics, the practice of center state politics in India is something that's absolutely critical to ensuring that, because otherwise, kind of all bets are off. And, I just hope that this will get sorted out, because that's an ingredient that I think that maybe I kind of knew a little bit, what might happen should center state, because remember when the GST was done, most of the states were aligned with the center, so conceptually one did think of what would happen, when the center state alignment would vary. But I was just hoping that, politics would evolve in a certain way. So I think these were the, really kind of conceptual questions about the design of the GST, which I think, I think about a lot more. And some of it, frankly, we did. It's not that we didn't think about any of these things earlier, but I think, as they say, stuff happens, or as Harold Macmillan famously said, events, dear boy, events, so that's, some of these things, you can't control. So that I think on the UBI, I do think that there's a very serious, risk, and it is a design challenge that, if it just becomes one more scheme on top of every other scheme, whatever. And this is a point that I think it's a kind of theoretical but very deep conceptual point. It's a point that I think I've heard Tharman Shanmugaratnam make in the context of Singapore. He says, ex ante, a desirable design feature of simplicity might really be the problem post facto. I'll give you an illustration, right? So, for example, in labor markets, we generally have two different ways of doing things, right? You can either have a minimum wage, or you have, what's called an EITC, which is basically like a tax credit for low-income workers. I think Tharman's point was that it may be ex ante minimum wage is actually a less complex policy. You don't have to mess around the tax code. You just announce it, whatever. But that very feature post facto, if you get competitive populism, for example, it's easier to keep raising the minimum wage than to, say, I'm, tackling some aspect of the EITC code. So similarly, there's a kind of risk with the UBI. It's very simplistic that people say, oh, you said 80 rupees a month. We will say 150 rupees a month. And so this is but in the real world, can you therefore say, because of this risk, I will not contemplate UBI at all? Or do you struggle with saying, no, I will, but let me see what are the kind of checks I can build into this going forward? And that's what makes, politics and policy making, so bloody hard, but also so important and challenging.
So let me get to another conceptual question now. But before I do, what you said about stuff happens reminded me of that famous John Lennon quote, life is what happens to you when you're busy making other plans. And I often use that at an sort of individual level to tell my friends why I have, written so few books in my life and so on and so forth. But now you've given a new context to it of the state. And I sort of totally get. And, what I, have noted in your book and in your writings is that whole political maneuvering to make, the cooperative federalism happen where the center and the states work together is also miraculous. And, an entire episode would not suffice to talk about that, because that's also quite phenomenal. And also it's undoubted that, I remember in Mihir Sharma's book Restart, he had an anecdote about how if you have to send a truck full of goods from two cities, I forget which one, two of Madras, Bangalore, Chennai, Bangalore, and Hyderabad, but from one to the other, rather than go over state borders, it's cheaper to send it to Paris and then have it sent to the other city from there. And that's obviously one of the things that GST would have eliminated. But my larger conceptual question is this: that you were talking about trade-offs and cost and benefit and so on, and this is something that I thought about at the time of demonetization, when costs and benefits were touted. And I of course, wrote against demonetization from day one. I thought it was a largest assault on property rights in human history. And it sort of seemed to me that when we talk of cost and benefits in that context, and it became stark in the context of demonetization, but I guess this is an inevitable part of public policy making anywhere, that when you talk of costs and benefits, you are talking about costs to one set of people at one point in time and benefits to another set of people at another point in time. And in the case of demonetization, obviously, the cost is so large to so many people and the benefits are dubious and invisible, that it seems beyond question. So let's not discuss it in the context of demonetization, but in the context of any public policy, whether it is GST or whatever. We often have to deal with trade-offs where one set of people get costs and another set of people get benefits. And it seems to me to be a sort of a danger to watch out for, what Hayek would have called the fatal conceit almost, that you can sort of treat these people as pieces on a chessboard, and you can just sort of plan out that, okay, I lose my knight here, but I get a checkmate there. But these are real people. These are individuals who also deserve to have their autonomy respected. And at the same time, these trade-offs are inevitable. You can't get around them in most public policy. So is this something that you think about? And then how do you guard against the kind of arrogance that might come, for example, from being in the state and having all these power over the lives of chess pieces, as it were?
So, you said let's talk of it, outside the context of demonetization. Let me make it easier, more interesting. Say, let's talk about it in the context of demonetization. Okay. Yeah. So one of the pieces that I'm, kind of proudest of having written is on the political economy of demonetization in my book. Here I don't want to get into controversy and talk about, good, bad, did I know, did someone else know, all of that. But to me, it was just the most fascinating experience of political economy. And let me, because you've thought about it, maybe you can, tell me why I'm completely wrong. You see, think about this, about demonetization, right? It also speaks to your question about autonomy, of respecting autonomy and so on. And I don't even know how to, given what I've seen, I don't even know how to think about these things anymore, right? That I think everyone would have agreed with you, and, that there would be a lot of short-term costs on a lot of people, right? Maybe there was some, potential long-term benefits, whatever. And, that's how it would play out. And therefore, both because there were a lot of people affected, it was quite, significant, and, the gains were more tenuous and long-term. So political economy would tell you that this would be a vastly unpopular policy. I mean, this is, when we think about, political economy, we say that, even in the context of trade policy, we say, if the losers are concentrated, the gainers are diffused, even though aggregated may be greater, the concentrated losers thing. Sure, it was not even concentrated losers. It was, the vast majority, and yet revealed preference. I don't want to draw too, but I think generally we would say that what happened in the UP election afterwards was certainly not a reaction against. If anything, it was maybe not a validation, but certainly relative to our prior that it should have had a huge impact. It did not have that impact. So at least that. So I'm still trying to understand why that is the case. To me, it's a complete political economy puzzle. It's a little bit like in the US and others. Even now, people are asking, this what's wrong with Kansas? Why do poor white middle class voters vote for an administration that threatens to take away the welfare benefits, provides tax cuts which you're not benefiting at all? How do you explain this? People voting against their apparent self-interest. Of course, there are arguments about identity here and so on. But there, it's like 80-90% very badly hit, and the intensity you can see, and yet they turn out and behave a certain way. So how do you explain this? And more I think about it, I think of these huge costs of demonetization as a feature, not a bug, in political terms. And so that's why this autonomy. So it's like, it had to be, a cost inflicted on a lot of people. And my explanation for this, ideas here, not a thing. One is that, you have to feel the pain for you to be convinced that it's a kind of, really important policy. It has to be widespread in its impact, because otherwise, the charge that it was selected, because remember, the puzzle of demonetization is, why did so many people have to be hit in order for these benefits? If you really wanted to, go after the rich, you have selective policy instruments to go after the rich. You don't have to take a huge swipe at so many people in order, because you can do tax raids, you can, you raise taxes. So you have selective instruments, but this was a conscious policy to use a bludgeon of an instrument, for some political, and it worked. So that's the puzzle because remember, the other thing in this was, it's interesting, right? That, many people said, just do why was the 500 rupee note all done? Why also the 1,000? Because after all, with the 500 rupee note, you're more likely to hit more poor people because, relative to the gains. So there was this puzzle about this. And my explanation for it is that, it had to be huge, because then it's like Thomas Schelling said, in a strategy of conflict, to show that you're doing something big, it's credible that it has to be costly. You can't do things on the cheap. So it's like situating your nuclear shelter right in the middle of the city, because you show that, that's a credible commitment. So the inflicting of the huge cost was part of that. The fact that it was uniform was to prevent against any allegation of corruption. And then, of course, maybe you tap into this notion that you want to sacrifice for a larger good. But in that sense, what is one therefore to make of it? That, you say that, you should respect autonomy, especially if you're inflicting. But the politician says, I have respected it. See, this is the proof.
Yeah, so I kind of have some related thoughts on that. First of all, I enjoyed your chapter on demonetization and off council very much, and in fact, the whole book is fabulous. I think all my listeners should pick it up. And you raised a couple of interesting questions there, and I'll share my thoughts on that. I won't say I'm answering them, but I'll just share my thoughts. One is, yes, the political benefit at the time blew me away, because I thought they would lose every district in UP, and instead it was a landslide, right? And my sort of couple of post-facto explanations that come to mind, and yours are also excellent, and I'll process them over time. And one was, of course, the explanation of Schadenfreude, that the poor didn't mind because they also saw the rich suffering. The other is that I think that Indians have such an ingrained state of fatalism that when bad things happen to them, they don't necessarily ascribe it to the state, because the state has been a constant failure over the last 70-something years. As Lant Pritchard called it, it's a flailing state. So that sense of fatalism kind of takes you through. But at some level, it doesn't matter what the explanation for this is. The point is that you're absolutely right. It was a political benefit for them. I would perhaps dispute, and you would maybe have better insider information, but I don't know how much intent there was behind this. My sense of this is that Mr. Modi genuinely thought that this will solve the problem of black money, and because he has not bought anything from a store in the last 20 years, he probably didn't realize that 500 rupee notes are something that are in everyday use, and he must have thought it's only for storing black money money under beds or whatever. And my sense was that they actually believed that it would work, and it so happened to work out in a way that it politically benefited them. The other question that you raise that I don't have a convincing answer for is that while you show that it did hit the economy, you point out that it does not seem to have hit the economy as badly as some people said it would when people spoke of a contraction of 8-9% and all of that. And to be honest, I myself overestimated the damage it would do according to the data. And that is going to bring me out down to a later question that when we know that so much of India is informal sector, and a lot of the data on how the informal sector is stuff that we get by proxies, how reliable is that data, and how much can we sort of taken into account. But that still doesn't answer sort of the core conceptual question, that even if the politicians knew that we will make them suffer and we will win votes at the end of it, it still doesn't justify causing suffering. And that dilemma still remains, that how do we talk about costs and benefits at a time where the costs go to one set of people at one time and the benefits to another? Like, how does one sort of resolve this, and where does one draw the line, saying that no matter what the costs are, this is where we draw the line, the costs will not exceed these? Like, can one
Yeah.
think about these?
Yeah. So again, Amit, I'm going to first take you up on. You've raised a number of questions, so I have them. So three things: one on the demonetization, one on the data, and then on the broader justifying this thing. Okay, all three. On the Schadenfreude thing, as I said, remember that I don't fully buy the Schadenfreude, because you have selective instruments. If you want to make show that you're want to go after the rich, you can do it in. I mean, why should I suffer to inflict? That's kind of a mystery, right? So that, I think, the fatalism point, it may be true, but Amit, the point is that even Milan, Vaishnav, and others have done something that certainly there was a period in the 2000s where we felt that there is a kind of law of Indian politics that there's anti-incumbency, that whatever, no matter what happens, that's not inconsistent with the fatalism argument. But we did see for a period good performance being validated in the polls. Whether it was in Madhya Pradesh Shivraj Chauhan or the re-election in Odisha, there was a period where, so the whole fatalism thing, it may be true in some times, but it does beg the question of why it's also not true in other times. On intent, of course, what do I know? Who knows what intent was? But, I think there are signs here and there that we can pick up. I think the 500 rupee note, I think that there was input showing that the 500 rupee note, there must have been input that 500 and 1000 are very different in terms of things, and if you look at some timing of these things, so I think you can't, I don't know, intent is finally, but certainly I think there was maybe some intent, but certainly in terms of consequence, I think the whole thing. Now, on the impact on the economy, I've been surprised as well. So it is certainly true that some of the impact is not picked up in the data, and I think we should completely think. But I think even allowing for that, the impact turned out to be less than we thought. And there's also a recent paper by the IMF chief economist Geeta Gopinath saying that. But for me, the most surprising aspect of this, which we wrote about, Josh Feldman and I wrote about in that 2019 paper about the slowdown, even pre-COVID. I think what we didn't fully anticipate was, remember, demonetization. One angle on that. Look, again, I'm not taking any stand justifying or not. This is a much broader question, but it did lead to a de facto financialization of savings, kind of the money under the carpet coming out, which then led to, in the mutual funds, etc. So in 18, I think 17, 18, there was a period when the economy had a bit of a mini boom, as it were, partially fueled by the financialization of the savings and some of that going into lending to real estate and so on. So this was, again, some kind of not completely anticipated consequence. So in that sense, demonetization, when someone does a kind of dispassionate economic analysis of this, 5-7 years, I think it's going to be, whatever all this, not taking away from the fact that the costs were huge. Now you come to this, how do you justify this, right? You see, I think, the great moral philosopher and intellectual of our time, Donald Rumsfeld, once said, you go to bat with the, army you have, war with, or not the army you wish you had. So, when you talk about, how do you justify this? You are, Amit, if I may say so, you are coming dangerously close to a framework that you actually don't, that you would disavow completely. Because, it's not as if, you can go meta over and say, some meta entity says this is justified, this is not justified. In these things, by definition, these are judgments that are made through democratic politics. And therefore, in some sense, these validations come from within the system, not by, a planner or a moral planner, that Amit should be completely against because he's against, the conceit of the regular planner. So in that sense, so all you can do is therefore, in democratic politics, the different, constituencies have to have the kind of, say and influence and power in democratic politics, because finally that's what you work with. You can't kind of go above a system, whether it is ideas or interests. I think you have to, and that's the sense in which I think you should read. There's a very nice piece by Jean Drèze about 2 years ago. It is this thing about who decides and for whom, and therefore, how do you ensure that the poorest, in this case, as you yourself said, a lot of poor people got affected. They were suffering from some grand false consciousness of Marx and, went and voted in a particular manner. But how do you protect them in the process? I mean, they have to be empowered, so it's basically you come back to saying, how can democratic representative politics be much better done? Because only then do you get these better decisions being made, because you go to bat with democratic politics, not with some, meta welfare system of decision making.
No, that's a fantastic answer, and it kind of addresses my query completely, because, I buy the fact that, my statement was not an absolutist statement that, oh, look at the costs and we should not do this. I recognize that even in doing nothing, there are costs and benefits. So you are making a choice no matter what you do, especially when you have the sort of coercive power of the state with you, which can bring us to another question, which perhaps we'll leave for some other day before we go to a commercial break and then come back to talk about your time as CEA. But the other question that it then leads to is that even within a democratic system where you're juggling different interests or whatever, where do you draw the line? Where do you draw the line and say that, no, the costs are too much here? And, is that something that you simply let interest decide, or is there some other compass or some other set of rules that can guide that? Because, there is that famous cartoon about two wolves and a lamb debating what to have for dinner, and one of them says, let's put it to the vote. So there's also sort of a danger there. Let's take a quick commercial break, and then we come back. We shall leave India for just a moment and visit Machu Picchu. If you enjoy listening to The Scene and the Unseen, you can play a part in keeping the show alive. The Scene and the Unseen has been a labor of love for me. I've enjoyed putting together many stimulating conversations, expanding my brain and my universe, and hopefully yours as well. But while the work has been its own reward, I don't actually make much money off the show. Although The Scene and the Unseen has great numbers, advertisers haven't really woken up to the insane engagement level of podcasts, and I do many hours of deep research for each episode, besides all the logistics of producing the show myself. Scheduling guests, booking studios, paying technicians, the travel and so on. So I'm trying a new way of keeping this thing going, and that involves you. My proposition for you is this: for every episode of The Scene and the Unseen that you enjoy, buy me a cup of coffee, or even a lavish lunch, whatever you feel it's worth. You can do this by heading over to sceneunseen.in/support and contributing an amount of your choice. This is not a subscription. The Scene and the Unseen will continue to be free on all podcast apps and at sceneunseen.in. This is just a gesture of appreciation. Help keep this thing going. seenunseen.in/support. Welcome back to The Seen and the Unseen. I'm chatting with Arvind Subramanian, and finally, after 2 hours of digressions and talking about ideas and concepts and so on, I'm delighted that I've reached the specific moment where he becomes a chief economic advisor. You mentioned you were on holiday in Machu Picchu when you got the phone call asking if you'd be interested. So kind of take me through the process of what your thinking was about the job. Should I take this job? What will I achieve? And also your early days in the job, where you described this as, quote, the most exciting job in the world, stop quote.
Yeah, family, we were all in Machu Picchu taking a family holiday. And in fact, I got an email from, someone asking whether I'd be interested in the job. And of course, this is kind of the dream job for, most economists who are interested in policy. And if you're, interested in working on your own country. And remember that, the wonderful thing about India is that, this notion, this concept of a technocratic policymaker, either working with or in government is not at all new. I mean, it goes back, decades. Even if you go back to the 60s and 50s, series of economists who've worked in, for, with government. And so this was just and also remember, we spoke about the would-be reformers who came to government in the 70s and 80s. We know the very illustrious people, Monte Kalwalia, Shankaracharya, Rakesh Mohan, Vijay Kelkar, so many, and I should name many, many more. And then, of course, Kaushik, Raghu, all these people. So it really is, for an economist, if you care about policy making. So for me, it was not a difficult decision at all to accept. I mean, the only question was how we would sort out my family was still in the US, son was still, in the last years of school. So, we had to work that out. And, but so I went to India. I kind of, met a few people, met Mr. Jaitley there. And then, of course, what happened. I thought I was about to get the job. And then for 2 months, there was, there was radio silence from the other end. And of course, apparently some pushback. And but finally, it happened. And of course, Mr. Jaitley was also had his operation, then his bariatric surgery. That's also the interregnum. And then, of course, when I came with a sense of, this is a dream job in terms of, all the things that needed to be done and could be done. And I was really a man on a mission with, thinking about nothing else. And from, what needs to be done, how it needs to be done, what teams do we need to build, what are the various aspects of policy you want to get involved in, how to, I did spend a fair amount of my time, thinking about the Indian Economic Service and how to, build capacity for them and, all of that. And then, of course, the public communication part of it, right? I mean, I had this, maybe a completely misguided, deluded desire that, everything that one does should be communicated in a way that kind of raises, the level of discourse on these issues in India. And that's why, when you look at the economic surveys, the point was it must be very rigorous, obviously, but it must also, it must come alive to people. And I don't know, I guess the motto for all this, the inspiration was that there's a famous quote by John Maynard Keynes about what it takes to be an economist. You should read that quote. He must be, mathematician, economist. He must be, aloof, but he must be in the weeds. It's like he must be everything. And that's the sense in which that's the kind of thing I had that. And it was very, very fortunate for me that I just had a dream boss who, open, constructive. It's not that he agreed with everything that I said or not, sometimes completely thing, but, that open communication and, and giving me both the freedom and the protection, actually both, to do this. And that's why, I said I would get involved in everything. And the other, in terms of the how, I think what is really critical, it's a point that, Pratap made in your piece as well. I think that when a kind of technocrat comes into policy making, he should be given no. He or she should not think that just because he has an expertise, therefore that kind of exempts him from the nitty gritty of building teams, working with people all down the hierarchy. And I really did want to, for example, when I worked on the GST, I used to work with people, undersecretaries, joint secretaries, really because they have so much value and knowledge, and it's not that I'm doing them a favor. They were doing me a favor because they knew. So just this working with as many people as possible in government, and to do as many things as possible. I was just driven by that, and I really wanted to do all that I could. And of course, the economic surveys provided a forum, and being involved, I think, in some critical policies like the GST, also provided a. But I did overreach. I did think that I was no CEA has any business to be involved in, because I felt that at the level of ideas, you could contribute even more than there's a part where you have to get into the trenches and do these things. But like in the Keynes quote, you should also be able to provide the big ideas around which you can have discussion. Whether they're going to get implemented immediately or not. It's not up to you, but can you provide what I would call, can you soak the intellectual ecosphere with ideas, then that others can, reject or dismiss or accept or whatever. So that's what, it was really an opportunity to do a lot of things.
I enjoyed your economic surveys a lot, especially the fact that you're starting each chapter with a quote from a work of literature and so on, far more readable than other such documents that I've read. And the interesting sort of thing that kind of struck me while reading your book and while reading what else you've written about it is that I was, if I may say so, filled with admiration for the man, which is you, but ambivalence about the post. Because as you've described the post, your only job, the only job of the chief economic advisor is the economic survey. And after that, it's then up to the man that what can I do? And you pointed out how you went about it with a sense of humility and team building, and you had been advised that don't just talk to the secretaries, talk to the joint secretaries, and you put in that time of effort. And there's another great quote from you from an interview that you did with Shekhar Gupta, which I'll link from the show notes, where you say, quote, "One thing we must try and avoid as economists is to try and trace a direct link between what you say and what gets done. It's much more complicated and subtle than that. You feed the ecosphere of ideas and policy making, and various other forces come into play, and then decisions are taken." Stop quote. So you point out about how, one, you're building a team that has both insiders from the Indian Economic Service as well as outside consultants, and you're making them kind of work together. Two, you're in touch with all the joint secretaries and the bureaucrats and so on. Three, it so happens that you have a very good relationship with the minister who's your boss, and all of these things are working. But what struck me while reading all this was that fine, you build these relationships, and therefore you've had whatever impact you have, some of which might even be diffused and hard to define precisely. But isn't this something that should be a little more systemic, built into the role of the position itself, rather than just say that, okay, the job of the CEA is to do the economic survey every year, and after that it's all up in the air?
So, it's something that I have thought about, right? But can I draw the analogy with kind of, institutions and politics, right? In all these things, there are kind of formal rules, setting of objectives, even monitoring outcomes, whatever. You have the whole system of formal things, but then so much of what we know about outcomes are determined by, individuals and the informal network of relations that you build. So the question is that I just feel that if that's true more broadly, why should it not be true of, any significant post in government like that of the CEA? So I think that, I think we have this slightly exaggerated importance in formal structures and formal rules, and not enough attention we pay. That's not to say that maybe you shouldn't define a few more things, for example, and maybe there is scope for that. But had I had a different boss, or had my temperament been a little bit different, regardless of what the formal rules were, the outcomes would have been very different. So I just feel that there should be both both a set of formal, a set of rules, but a lot more gets. It's like politics as well. There are politicians who do well and politicians who don't do well. It's by dint of their personality and so on. So why would that be any different here? So while that's not a thing to not have some more kind of structure, but I think there is enough structure to kind of, give the opportunity to the incumbent to kind of play a helpful role both inside and outside government.
And many of us have an impression of the state which comes, especially for people of my generation, from watching Yes Minister and Yes Prime Minister, where Parkinson's law, that the only thing a bureaucrat wants to do is expand their budgets or their power or whatever. And but of course, in Yes Minister, your caricature bureaucrat is deliberately obfuscatory. While whatever I've heard from people who work within the system in India is that bureaucrats are often incredibly smart, well-informed, well-meaning. They want to do the right thing. And yet it seems sometimes that the system is so creaky and things happen so kind of at snail's pace. So, even with the best intentions, I'm very fascinated to know about sort of your experience in the belly of this beast.
I would say that, I went in and I have come out with an enormous admiration for all the, most of the colleagues that I've worked with, right down the hierarchy, from secretaries to the lowliest, whatever I say, lowly only in a hierarchical, not in any pejorative sense at all. There are people at the lower end who have so much to contribute as well, and I think my default mode was people were helpful, people were constructive, people were wanting to be nice and good. But yet it is true that the sum turns out to be a little bit. This is what you were, I think, implying as well. The sum does turn out to be a little bit different, than the parts. But that being said, I think that I would not succumb to any kind of cynicism or negativity about the quality of staff and the quality of state capacity within government. They're just exceptional people across the sphere. And you will get your in any institution you will get your people on the left tail of the distribution, and it's not a, but you certainly don't get more of that, say, in the Indian government. And I would say on the right tail, you get a lot of exceptional people on the right tail that you can work with. So that's why I think that certainly as kind of personal advice or whatever, to work in government is kind of still the a high calling. It's a worthwhile calling, and I would urge, and that's why I do believe strongly that all the technocratic services like the Indian Economic Service and so on. I think we must invest a lot in improving their capacity, their training, and so on, because I think ultimately it matters a lot. Ultimately, see, just stepping back a little bit, Amit, I think there was a view of the world, and I think it's a legitimate view that what the state needed to do was not do certain things. But I think we've come around to the view, while that's very, very important, I think that the state also has to do a lot of good things, and I think this kind of and I certainly saw myself, my office, the Indian Economic Service, other parts of government as very much part of state capacity. And when for example, the economic surveys were reasonably well read and internationally also well read, I felt that this was really an effort to show that Indian state capacity could deliver at international levels of efficiency and standards, and sometimes maybe even more, and that it's doable, that we have the ability to do that. It's not because we don't have the talent or we don't have whatever, or we have, this image of, the kind of bad bureaucratic state at all. I think that the Indian state certainly allows opportunities for people to express themselves and contribute as much. So I would not at all succumb to any kind of cynicism or negativity on that score. And it's not just true, my being in CA. I mean, it's been true. How many technocrats have done such good work in Indian government? I think it's really it. But it is true. I mean, all that being said, a lot is going to so partially answering your question of then why does the sum turn out to be different? I mean, it's certainly the usual. What is the ecosphere of ideas? Politics, political compulsions, interests, and so on. Obviously, they're going to have a final say in what gets done. So that I think that. But the input on the part of the technocrats can be as good as needs to be, and I don't think the system holds that back in any systematic way.
That's what I've heard from all my friends in policy, that there is no shortage of intellectual capacity. That even in terms of mindsets have gradually changed, which is why it's constantly kind of baffled me that for so many years in so many of the different areas like agriculture, for example, or education or whatever, we know what the solutions are. Journalists have been writing about it for 20, 30 years. It's part of the ecosystem, the ecosphere of ideas, as you say in it, yet nothing seems to get done. Which was a mystery to me. And I guess one part of the mystery could be just politics. Like, it has always seemed to me that, politics becomes a fatal flaw when you want to carry reform out, because the incentives of politicians, deviate in two significant ways. One is the short termism, that they need to win elections all the time, and therefore they want to do something which will show results immediately and not 10, 15 years down the line, and which is attributable to them. And secondly, in the sense that populist ideas sell, that a lot of the ideas, the more complex ideas of economics, like spontaneous order and the positive sum nature of voluntary interaction, they're deeply unintuitive. People don't get it. Well, people very easily get, ideas of welfareism and handouts and things which sort of coincide with our intuition of the world as a zero-sum game, which of course it's not. So, how was it for you to then sort of work with politicians within the system? And did you, when you were selling reform to them, did you have to add a layer of it, not just a layer of what is the economic benefit, but what is a political benefit?
Absolutely. I think that, look, fundamentally, I think, Amit, one way of putting it would be to say that if you did not believe that good economics was good politics, right, we should just give up on our thing, right? But the only thing is that you qualify that, or you at least reconcile yourself to the fact that, the horizons over which that might happen might not be, one election, but, whatever. But even within that, I think, people, I certainly did not subscribe to the views that you give the technical thing and, let the politics take over. No, you know, lots of my discussions with the senior politicians would be to say why good economics is good politics, and sometimes as again, I think the Keynes quote that you have to be behave like a grubby politician. You have to be in the trenches. You have to use all the arguments that you can. For example, in the case of the GST, for example, you know, I would say that we need low rates because you're a party that believes in low taxes and lower inflation. So so harnessing those kinds of arguments to make your case I think are critical. So I think that, but if fundamentally good economics is not good politics over various over a sufficiently long period of time, then of course it's a difficult thing. But I do want to come back to one so when we talk about the sum and the parts, right? What you said, there's supply of capacity, but the outcome depends upon the demands of the demand side, which is politics and so on. So here's, I think, I don't know whether this came up in your talk on education. So it was very rewarding or very heartening in a certain period in Indian politics when you felt that routine anti-incumbency gave way to electoral politics being rewarded by good or bad performance, rewarded through good and penalized through bad performance. But here's, I think, one of the biggest. Take the field of education, for example, right? It was the original sin. We didn't do basic education. But here's a kind of a puzzle of Indian politics that I kind of still grapple with is if you have a lot of poor, uneducated kids, why does democratic politics not make the provision of that an electorally, rewarding exercise? So that's kind of the demand side that, all of us, we may say, no simplicity in the GST, but, finally, at least democratic politics should reward that. So in the case of education, you see, and remember, because it's a state subject, or at least whatever, this is a question that over 70 years, why was it not the case that some state government somewhere in time, because, it's not that there are, 10% of the population is uneducated. It's like, massive amounts. So you would think, one. But second, the puzzle gets compounded because in the post-liberalization era, when the private returns to education went up so much, why didn't people get even more things saying, look, it's not even a social good, it's a private good. My kids will get better jobs, get higher salaries because this. Why didn't that also, I think, so if that part of the puzzle is in some sense inadequate or missing, then you will always flounder in terms of the kind of almost the frustration that you feel that how come outcomes are so disappointing relative to this. I think that's kind of fundamental in democratic politics, and that's why I'm not a partisan. I have no party affiliation or anything, but it did seem to be the case that the Aam Aadmi Party in its first term staked its electoral fortunes on health and on the provision of health and education. That was made it a really interesting thing because they were saying, look, crudely speaking, vote for us because we provide your kids health and education. So if that, and that's true not just in education, but in other places as well. So if you're in this system of democratic politics, you always have to, wonder or take account of the fact that if there's a gap between outcomes and capacity, there is that black box of democratic politics, which I think is going to invariably affect the outcome. And so cracking that in some sense is going to be more as important as just having smart people in government, smart technocrats in government.
No, that's very insightful what you just said. But the two halves of what you just said seem to be at cross purposes because, I agree with you that good economics should be sold as good politics for it to get through. But it doesn't seem to me to be the case that good economics is good politics because, demonetization was good politics and I don't think it was good economics. But even apart from that, I mean, I think it is evident that if good economics was good politics, and given that politics is a game of supply and demand, we would all be doing well. All policies would be good because, politics would see to that. But that seems to be not be the same. And I wonder if you have any candidate answers for the question that you pose that, given that we are so uneducated and people want it and all of that, still the state hasn't been able to, fix a problem, which would, seem to, which is a very powerful and evocative rhetorical question because obviously it's a great moral failing of the Indian state that we have failed so miserably in this. But what are sort of your candidate answers for that? Why is it the case that the supply hasn't caught up with the demand in terms of outcomes?
I mean, you would have to get into what are the failings of Indian democratic politics more broadly, and I think that certainly the fact that the points that you've said are not unimportant. So I think one point that you made, I think, is really very important, and I think it's worth emphasizing. It's not so much the short-term thing, but a related, in politics, attribution and getting credit for what you do is like, absolutely fundamental to democratic politics. And I think that's, when you think about why did this government choose the public provision of private goods and services, that's part of the answer. You know, if you produce, if you say I produce more growth, the link between the outcome and who was responsible for that outcome gets attenuated, as it were. But when you provide the toilets, when you provide this or all of that, for example, I think that attribute. So the thing with with things like health and education, certainly, education, the fact that it's not, because remember, so the attribution thing which you raise, there are two dimensions to it in India. One is what we just spoke about, who gets credit. The second thing is that gets mixed in with federalism. So for example, if someone at the center wants to do something that was the prerogative of the states and cannot get credit for that, it's going to be underprovided. So schooling and health are provided by state governments, and therefore you want to not emphasize that, because if you just give more resources and god forbid it actually succeeds, someone else is getting the credit for that and you don't. And that's why also, if you see, for example, the health schemes that were started were schemes that for which the attribution could be for the person at the center providing this. So I think it's so for me that was a new learning experience. It's we know good economics, we know the short termism, but how do you satisfy this? And that's intrinsic to politics. You get elected, but in a sense, but remember that in a sense that should also take away your cynicism, because that if a politician is craving attribution, then there's it matters to the he knows that it matters to the voters for him to want attribution in the first place, and therefore it should kind of say that, well, how can I do things that that can not only be done, but for which attribution can be appropriated, as it were, so that it also makes makes for good politics. So I think these are, I think this attribution thing is just so. That's also why when leaders kind of want to do schemes, they want it to be associated with them, and and not with anyone else. So it has a downside, and it has it. But it can potentially be harnessed. But it's just something that you cannot ignore about democratic politics. So if it were the case that I guess if it were the case that somehow you could show within 5 years that your child, because of what I did, actually got a better job and more earning power. Problem is that can't happen. That there is a so there is a problem. Attribution cannot be. If there are things that have long gestation lags, you have to contend with that as well. So it just makes policy making more difficult. But again, not shouldn't fall prey to giving up or cynicism. But that's what I would strongly feel.
No, that issue of attribution is a fantastic nuance.
But it also strikes me that, in some cases, for example, let's take agriculture, right?
I was going to come to agriculture, by the way. But go ahead. But go ahead.
Yeah, no, it is often the case that the demand would be for a policy that is bad economics and not for something that is good economics. For example, the farmer may not want the removal of MSPs or fertilizer subsidies, but may instead want a farm loan waiver. And often a farm loan waiver is a necessary anesthetic, so I'm not disputing that. But the core structural reforms, like the removing the MSP or removing fertilizer subsidy or power subsidy, for example, which makes Punjab grow so much rice when it has no business growing rice, for example, those can never happen because those cannot be sold politically. And that seems to me to be a clear instance of where economics and politics run counter to each other.
No, but Amit, okay, let me actually a little bit push back a little bit, right? So look, the world over, once you give an entitlement, taking away an entitlement is a universal law of politics, that it's called the third rail here, whatever, there are something. So I would not say, therefore, the fact that you can't take away subsidies is bad politics, right? So the challenge, therefore, for policymakers and politicians is, in fact, so just to give a concrete example, you certainly cannot take away fertilizer subsidies on its own in India, right? But look at the two successes that have happened, right? So this tells you that the options are in. One is that supposing you tied the taking away of the subsidy to a universal basic income. So you linked two reforms in a way that you don't take away an entitlement, you just replace it with a better, more efficient entitlement. So that's a way forward for thinking about policy making in creative ways. The other thing, of course, is that remember how the petroleum subsidy was eliminated in India. It's just very small but very frequent changes over time, so that it's kind of the behavioral economics insight where you say you don't want to impose huge costs suddenly. The costs are spread out over time, and then you can in that case, even without replacing it, you were able to eliminate the subsidy. So I think there are lots of ways like that. So I think the other kind of behavioral economics thing is that the whole give it up scheme early on, for example, right, is a kind of way of can you kind of use name and shame kind of things to say it's like the way I would implement a universe. I had this kind of fascinating discussion with the Telangana chief, Mr. KCR, on his, he was the original scheme, the Raitu Bandhu scheme, right? That was a kind of, in some ways, India's first, kind of, I mean, so to be a universal basic income kind of scheme, not quite, but sort of. And talking with him about the politics of that is actually fascinating. So if you think about it, right, my preferred thing is not a universal basic income, but a quasi-universal basic income, i.e., don't give it to everyone, give it to everyone, but a few at the top, because you can make it more affordable, you can make it less costly, and also the notion that the big businessmen don't deserve a 10,000 rupee check. It's kind of clever, right? And also it may be more easier to implement. But here's where ideas like don't make the taking away mandatory, but kind of make it voluntary, for example. So there are lots of ideas like that which can make reasonable policy making, good policies feasible, and not say take nowhere in the world can you take away an entitlement and say this is and say so. I think again. It's the task of policymakers and technocrats to kind of internalize this when they talk about policy making.
Looking back on your time as chief economic advisor, what would you look at, as your biggest success? Maybe not a specific policy, but just a process you put in place or whatever. What frustrated you the most? And most interestingly, is there something that you've changed your mind on, during the course of becoming the CEA?
Right, that's a great question. See, I think that in terms of any one, any one thing, I think it'd be difficult to say, because I guess what I would want a kind of people to take away is that fundamentally what we spoke about, that there are things that are doable across the board. It's not any one thing, whether it's better advice for policy making, better analysis, better communication, so a whole more training, building capacity, working with youngsters, lots of things are, I think, so it's more, we should have more ambition about state capacity in some ways. I think that's what I would hope. Maybe there'll be people who say, no, it shows exactly the opposite. There'll be people who say that as well. On, I write in my book that, I think the fertilizer subsidy is, I worked really hard on that, and, nothing really happened. And that for me was kind of a big disappointment, which of course there were other aspects. I mean, the way the kind of GST turned out relative to the original conception, I think that also was left me a little bit. But I think hopefully these are not irretrievable mistakes. I hope they can be rectified. The last question about, I have changed my mind on, specific aspects of, you know, even the whole GST, what we spoke about, the trade-off between efficiency and the loss of fiscal sovereignty. I think I have learned that, maybe that trade-off is much more complicated than we originally thought. I think that. I think we didn't go into this, but the whole kind of measurement issue, which I think is also something that I feel we maybe we could have done more on, and although I did try to do within government, that's something that, but I fundamentally come away more feeling that you know a kind of optimism and hopefulness that these are opportunities for doing, rather than the more kind of pessimistic, cynical view that that actually this experience shows. So in some ways, my ex ante going into government, as I said, was that ex ante I thought that actually it would be much more difficult. Ability to do things would be much less. But I come away actually having changed my ex ante perception of this, and certainly feel that these are all opportunities for where one should be more optimistic, proactive, and have the belief that things can be done well, and done well, and rather than the others. So there is a change in my ex ante view, but ex post, I come away thinking that, in that sense, ex post, I feel, I have not changed that much about looking back, that, you can do a lot. And so, let's see, I think that's what I kind of come away with. No, in particular regrets, particular highs, I think there will be, but, those are, but fundamentally, I think, of course, with the caveat, always the caveat, and I don't want this. The caveat always is that all of this is subject to the broader, configuration of personalities and politics. I don't want to, by any means, discount that. So that's kind of, that's a card that you don't control. So that you just work with that.
I must confess here that, I'd expected that over this time you would have become less hopeful, but it turns out that you're actually more hopeful, which, should give all of us hope as well, that maybe there is scope for change in the system. I've taken up a lot of your time, so I'll come to my penultimate question now before I go to my final question, which is a penultimate question is that, and I want this to be a pre-COVID question, that before COVID happened in March or in Feb or whenever, if you were to take stock of the Indian economy as things are today, and sort of describe what is wrong with it and what the big dangers are, and what are the things that we should be worried about, what would you pick? Like, one subject that we haven't spoken on at all during this, but you've written so much on, is the financial system, the credit crisis. I was part of this reading group which was active last year, which was run by Ajay Shah, and he'd brought your friend Josh Feldman to it a couple of times. And Josh used to scare everyone by talking about how the credit crisis was such a cancer within the Indian system and was just affecting every other part of the Indian economy, and how disastrous it was. And I get the same sense when I read the things that you have written, that I think that, people who are not familiar with policy and the actual particulars don't really understand how bad things really are. So is that your main concern about the Indian economy? Like, how would you sum up the things that worry you?
Again, here I want to give the answer at two levels, right? One is that, even the paper that Josh and I wrote in 2019, when we said the economy was in ICU, this is pre-COVID, right? And remember, at that stage, we said that the twin balance sheet problem had become the four balance sheet problem, because, and by the way, I have to give, two people entire credit for alerting me to how important. One is Josh, of course, who from day one has been telling me it's important. And of course, the work of Ashish Gupta, I think, has been very, very influential in thinking about this, the empirical basis for that view. But, in late 2019, we said that the twin balance sheet problem had become the four balance sheet problem. right? And in recent pieces we've written, our view is that now, rather than identifying balance sheets which have a problem, it's probably easier to or identify those that don't have a problem, because almost every balance sheet is short in India. But here's, I think, a kind of, so I think that's problem number one, right? But there's a kind of deeper question here, and I think I want to raise this, in the last minute, is that, why is it that policymakers have not taken this seriously in India? Because that's the deeper question. All of us can keep saying, but it's not resonating with the kind of intensity that it should, right? And I have two kind of tentative solutions for the hypotheses for that. One is that, it's in the nature of these things that when you have big disruptive changes like crises, you have more of a policy response. When you have a kind of slow bleed kind of situation, which is what this whole financial crisis has been about, because remember, we identified the twin balance sheet in 2014, I think that, that the slow bleed is, by definition, not conducive to, you say, acha chalta hai, okay, not 5%, we'll get 2, 3, 4%, or maybe 5.5%, but whatever. And that lack of that, by the way, and this is abstracting from the usual, political interest, commercial interest, crony capitalism, all of that is there. But I want to get into something, why don't policymakers respond? And I think my second hypothesis for this is that, look, it's, that India has never had the only major crises it has had are all macroeconomic and whatever. 66 we had the food crisis. Basically the 4 F's. Food, fuel, forex, fiscal. These have been the sources of crisis, and usually they've been fairly disruptive and sudden and things, and people have responded. So whether it's 66 or 91 or 2013 or now big things happen, you want to respond. 1979, 80 as well. This is like a slow bleed, not slow bleed, but we've had no experience of this in the past. So we have not been kind of, socially kind of inoculated to this kind of, we don't, it's a bit like, why did the West, not react as quickly to COVID as East Asia? I mean, remember, as Nietzsche said, that which doesn't kill you makes you stronger. East Asia was hit by pandemics, serious enough, but which didn't kill them. So they had this social immunity. Western Europe never saw a pandemic, so it was very strong. So in that sense, we've never had a history of, financial crises which have exacted a huge toll. It is exacting a huge toll, but it's gradual and it's unprecedented. So I think that's part of the reason why, the whole policy making, Josh and I have struggled with this, that, say, he kept saying, boss, it's a diagnosis problem. It's not and that diagnosis is, elusive. It doesn't really, resonate with people. Never had it before. What is, financial crisis? We'll recapitalize the banks, or, credit ko hum chala denge, we'll get a bit more growth. So this is like, a slow bleed and unprecedented with no kind of social inoculation. And that's kind of explains part of the reason why I think, so it's a kind of a little bit more conceptual kind of stepping back answer to, yes, we have a massive problem in the financial system. Post-COVID, of course, it's gotten much, much worse. We have these deeper things. And then, of course, you have that extra layer that, if in a system, the transparency of the reality is kind of obscured and hidden and things again and again and again, that is another thing that adds to. So the broader problem of, kind of data transparency that, I've written about in the context of the GDP and things, that I think is kind of like a much deeper system. I don't know what Vijay Kelkar and Ajay Shah say about this in their book, but this is kind of very kind of deep, I think. And unless we can crack that as well. And by the way, it's true for the GDP, it's true for the financial system, it's true for the fiscal numbers, it's true for the unemployment numbers, it's true for the consumption numbers. We've got a situation where kind of basic, the basic ingredients for integrity and accountability, I know, are kind of eluding us in that sense, and that is kind of very worrying as well. And that pertains, of course, also. So in a sense, I've tried to answer your questions at three levels, right? Yes, twin has become four, but the deeper reason why we haven't responded, maybe even a meta reason for that, is that basic, transparency, the ingredients for transparent, but I mean, it could be both supply and it could be all, of course, these are things that, we don't have, you get the data that you want to in some ways. So I think there's some of that as well. But, that's kind of my view on these kind of bigger issues as well.
That's very enlightening. And this episode suddenly became much darker, and it's going to get even darker with my last question. So we'll end it there, because if I go beyond that, we'll be in zombie apocalypse territory. But my last question is this: that we are now, in the middle of this COVID pandemic, and I don't even know if I should say middle, because we don't know how long this is going to go on. I hope this is not just kind of the beginning, and obviously this is like, to everything that was going wrong, this is a force multiplier. It's just a disaster. It's probably set us back many years. So sort of looking into the future, let me say that we are in 2020. If you look at 2030, what's your best case scenario, and what's your worst case scenario for India, keeping all this in mind? And maybe it's unfair of me to make COVID part of the question, because it'll, get into the territory of what the philosopher you like to quote, Donald Rumsfeld, calls unknown unknowns. So just sort of leaving COVID out of it, and assuming that a vaccine comes along soon and it doesn't get too much worse, assuming that, if you look ahead to 2030, what would you say is our best case scenario and our worst case scenario? What gives you hope and what gives you despair, rather, to frame it differently?
See, when I look back on, the last 2 decades, so it's kind of a little bit slightly a longer view on the future, by, you look at the past. The truth is that, we've had 1 decade of, weak performance. Basically since about 2011, I think we've had weak performance, and maybe that's what is the message of Pooja Mehra's book on the lost decade, right? And certainly my own, looking at the numbers and what happened, it seems like kind of so it's been longer. The underperformance and weakening has been much longer than this. Maybe to add to that little bit pessimism is that, I mean, you could also make the case that while the weakening has been a decade old, new active positive reforms basically stopped in the early 2000s. That's one view. That's also, I think, the view of some people. Even Raghu, has that view. I would kind of dispute that. I think at least conceptually, the GST was a major reform. Of course, it went through a thing. I think the public provision of private goods is something. I think the bankruptcy did conceptually allow us to address this problem of, decades old problem of capitalism without exit. But given that they're also faltering, you could say we have had 1 decade of underperformance and 2 decades of not enough policy reforms, and even state capacity has not really been strengthened. So the bad case scenario is that this is not a 3 or 4 year old problem. Is actually a 2 decade old problem, and therefore this kind of continues going forward. And of course now the starting point is much worse, because COVID has really kind of shot all balance sheets, and the world looks completely different post COVID. Now, how do you kind of try and extract some glimmer of hope from this? I guess the glimmer of hope, actually, potentially, what could be the glimmer of hope? I'm not saying that's what will happen. This thing has to be rescued from by politics. In India, this is democratic politics. That if you believe that, if you believe that actually our politics is getting once again decoupled from economic performance, which is what some of the indicators are saying, that's going to add to the sense of thing. But I think the way to extract something is to say, look, even for this government, it's kind of much more confident, right? It has more political capital. And, it also has built up some credentials on this, legitimacy, this provision of public goods, whatever, that there is a sense in which the new welfareism has worked. I think that agenda needs to be completed for all of this, the JAM infrastructure, etc., or UBI, whatever. That thing has to be completed. But in principle, you have the political capital to actually do the things that need to be done, whether it's IBC or reforms or growth or whatever, or all these things. So I think so that would be one kind of possibility that the conditions are there, but the mindset and the diagnosis has to be right, and then you move forward. The other, of course, I think always the perennial glimmer of hope about India is that it's not one country. It's a it's a country of 27 quasi sovereigns or whatever. And then you think that some of the positive change, even if it doesn't happen at the center, there will be pockets where good things will be done. Maybe people will see what AAP has done on health and education, and the kind of competitive federalism by way of ideas kind of spreads in that way as well. So the potentially good news is that we have different governments in different parts of the country, which we now, and they embark on post-COVID. All of them are in bad trouble, but post-COVID they say, look, for example, public health, all of us need to be more like Kerala. We learned lessons for that. Education, we can take lessons from this. So I think attracting investment, whatever, So I think federalism, competitive federalism in India always is hope. See, in the old days, we used to say about India, it has the wheels of a bullock cart and the brakes of a Rolls Royce, as a kind of system that always only did incremental things. But I think that there's no reason why you could also not have new ideas coming from different parts of the country. And that kind of drives and motors change, at least in parts, which then spreads elsewhere. So, so that would be my, trying to, pick up some glimmer of hope in what are obviously very, very challenging times. But it's not just. I think for me the real kind of looking back, in fact, post my CA-ship. You look back and say it's been, 1 decade of weak performance, and then another decade maybe of inadequate reforms, and maybe we need to think about it in those, terms, even when thinking about what needs to be done and whether things can happen going forward.
And maybe one day we'll have the wheels of a Rolls Royce and the brakes of a bullock cart and fall right into the river. I've been so enlightened and inspired to have this conversation. Thank you so much, Arvind, for your time and your insights.
Amit, it's been great to be on the show. Wonderful questions, and it's a hallmark of a conversation. In terms of how much I've had to think and how many new thoughts have been provoked by your questions. So, thank you very much.
Thank you.
If you enjoyed listening to this episode, do hop on over to your nearest bookstore online or offline and check out the 3 books written by Arvind, especially his latest book, Off Council, The Challenges of the Modi-Jaitley Economy. You can follow Arvind on Twitter at Arvind Subraman. That's without the IAN at the end, Arvind Subraman, one word. You can follow me at Amit Varma, AMITVARMA. You can browse past episodes of The Seen and the Unseen at seenunseen.in. Thank you for listening. Did you enjoy this episode of The Seen and the Unseen? If so, would you like to support the production of the show? You can go over to seenunseen.in/support and contribute any amount you like to keep this podcast alive and kicking. Thank you.